So we're back for our fifth recording session, talking about games in society. And throughout the semester, we've been doing any number of different kind of very specific topics in more of a non-serial way, right? While all of the theories do in some way inform each other, any one day is pretty much its own topic. But I do hope that as we go through, you're starting to see how these things go together, whether we're talking about game design, whether you're just trying to better understand your own gaming experiences. Maybe you're thinking about doing research. We haven't gotten a really strong sense of whether or not we'll be able to do research in the spring. So that's a bit of a tough one, right? It's one of those things where we technically can, but it's a matter of dealing with some of the threat and hassle of having to try to collect data during a pandemic. And for me, it's just not worth it. So we have been scaling back on that. I do have an update on our gaming labs. I think I told the class that one of the things we've been taking time off this semester, since we're not collecting data and because the lab for the most part is pretty empty, right? We've been instead renovating. And so we've mostly got our new television set up. We set up I think they said they set up the HTC Vive sets. We're trying to reconfigure the computer setup in there. Essentially what we're going to be doing is using our large screen as the main monitor. So the computer would be sitting on the desk just like any other gaming console. And we're kind of in the home stretch there. So we've got our VR rig, our cockpit rig and those kind of things. Hopefully the next couple of weeks. I know Lindsay's been working really hard on this to try to get us some stuff done. And hoping by December that, we have something. So I'm thinking maybe for folks who are in town, there's a slight chance that in December we might be able to at least do some kind of sneak peek. So I'm thinking like for Tech VR, for example, we may have a chance to finally pop in there and at least take a peek at it. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, it's been a trying semester for some of that kind of stuff, but, we're doing the best we can there. But yeah, Lindsay's been doing an amazing job. She's been doing all of our setup, like wiring everything, arranging the room, designing the room, really trying to make it look. And I know Phil, I think, was in there just a couple days ago with our PS4 VR stuff. PS5 looks neat. We'll probably get one. I want to wait to see if they're a little smaller. I don't know if anybody's seen some of them. They're huge. They're like dinner platters. I'm like, well, I don't have room for that.
Yes, the PS5 support on VR is a little iffy. Most of it isn't actually supported.
Sure, and that's any first launch, right? That's one reason why I didn't get too excited about the launch is because just in my history of gaming, right? Let the launch come out, let them work the bugs out, and then, swoop in later and grab one. I also wasn't personally super excited about the launch games, but, I mean, that's just a personal thing. Spider-Man looks cool. I'm still playing the one I have right now.
Well, the thing for me is that the PS5 is backwards compatible with PS4 games.
That's pretty cool.
99% of it.
In fact,
which, it also runs them better, like at higher frame rates, and it has an SSD, so it loads faster.
I have a first-run PS2, and the reason I'll never get rid of it is because the first-run PS2s were backwards compatible with PlayStation 1. And for that reason, I'll never get rid of it because it's because of that. I have a stack of PS1 games, right, that I can still play. And I think, Alex, the other thing is if you're a PS Plus subscriber, there's some huge benefits to getting PS5 because there's I forgot how many games they're giving away free in addition to the normal PS Plus games. So I have a feeling I'll probably jump on it. You're gonna laugh at me. What I'm waiting for is I have a whole bunch of frequent flyer miles on United. And they sell consoles, and so I'm just waiting for them to offer a PS5 from the very moment they do, because I can't go anywhere for the next year and a half. And
I remember reading somewhere that the new Xbox, somewhere in the code of something, I forget the exact specifics.
Well, that's how I got my PS4, was through frequent flyer miles. I actually was scrolling through one day, and they shipped me a PS4, 2 controllers, and just 3 random games. I have a feeling it was some warehouse somewhere and they had just come out and, anyway, that's what I'm waiting for mine because I'm not taking a flight for an eternity,
Yeah,
But
I heard the new Xbox might be supporting VR though, because there's.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about something else. Gotcha.
No, I know it's just there were things in I think various drivers and I think the dumps of a couple games that it said Xbox VR or something like that. So
It's probably a matter of time.
cool if like
You
the
know.
reverb was supported on the new Xbox. That'd be crazy.
I think the real question is going to be whether or not there's an added benefit, right? So what we see in game development, and we talk about it in our class, right? Some of the more, you know, like with natural mapping, right? That it's a cool technology, but for many gamers, the relative advantages isn't quite there, right? Not that it's not neat, but like at the grandest scale, you know, there's the time and cost investment. The difference now, I think, is that we're starting to see folks get better at developing in 3D. And I suspect that in earlier times, that was the big linchpin, right? Is that we don't know how to tell stories with this new technology. So you get a new technology and it tells, we'll talk about today, right? It tells stories in new dimensions, but we don't write them for new dimensions. And as a result, it's just a video game where people throw things at you, right? And it just didn't quite work out. So I suspect we'll see a maturation on that side. In fact, here at TED, go ahead.
I don't know if you saw the deck of gear, the like $450 index quality with like full face tracking.
Mm-hmm.
I actually have a friend who said he pre-ordered one, so I'll be able to learn about that.
As the cost comes down, it will play a role, right? Of course, the fear we get into, I don't know if anybody knows the history of the like the early 80s Atari and the game market in general. That one of the things that happened in the early 80s was that there was such a flood of games on the market for different systems that there was no quality control. And it ended up, you know, almost killing the games industry. The famous E.T. story I'm sure you've all heard of, where they ended up burying the games in the desert because they just could not sell them, right? And of course, Nintendo was one of the first companies to arise out of those ashes. Of course, they had to do some things that were pretty anti-capitalist, right? I mean, they basically put in near monopolies on game design. They did a lot of things to control the development of their games. It also worked to save the industry, right? Because there was I don't know how familiar you are with this, but when you would buy a Nintendo, there was the Nintendo seal of quality on it. And technically, a game had to have that sticker to work in a Nintendo. There's a real famous story behind a Christian group that was making fake Nintendo cartridges. And they're very famous games. In fact, if you find them on sale, they're usually pretty expensive because they kind of got away with it. I used to have two of them. They're like one was an RPG style game and one was like a platformer. But the catch-22 of that is it kind of saved the industry. But what we're seeing in VR, of course, is a mass proliferation of different devices. And they'll be curious to see how those all work themselves out. Of course, the difference now is that gaming is so widely accepted on the market that it's probably not going to crash a market. It's more along the lines of like, will we use this controller or not, right? So it's going to be an exciting couple of years to follow how these things integrate, you know, especially with VR, where we're seeing a lot of this really strange, like purposeful attempts to make the VR devices personal. So like the Oculus Quest, right? Having to have a single Facebook account tied to it. And if you want to switch it, you have to reset your device, which is very different, right, than plugging a controller in that Sega. And I can just plug in whatever controller I want, right? So that's going to be curious. But we'll get into that as we go and see if we can work some of these conversations into our content today. Someone asked what the image was on screen. Well, it's Mario. It's Mario thinking really deeply. And you may not recognize what he's wearing, but this is the Tanuki suit from Super Mario Bros. 3. What's that?
Mario Bros. 3. Actually,
yeah.
It's not the full Tanuki, the suit. It's just the
tail. Yeah. And you might recognize this pose. I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's the thing, man.
Yeah, Rodin's Thinker. Right? And it's kind of a fun play on the idea of meaningful games, right? Quick reminder as we go through, the week of Thanksgiving in the U.S. is an opportunity for extra credit for anybody in class who hasn't gotten full credit on their post. Maybe you missed a post. You can go into your grades from Teams. They'll tell you exactly what your points are. You can make up some points the week of Thanksgiving. That is the week that our colleagues in Taipei will be talking about moral panic. So they'll be using the readings and the videos from our discussion on moral panic. As a reminder, we're always several weeks in advance because of the semester shift. So if you want to, that week, you can log into the Moodle account, just like you would for any other discussion. And you can hop in there. And actually, while we're talking about discussions, as one more reminder, I believe that this week, and you should see it on screen right now. Sorry, it kind of cut off a little bit. This coming week, there's a discussion on Moodle for natural mapping. Okay, so the videos we recorded about natural mapping in VR earlier in October, the discussion for that is this coming week. Okay, so don't forget to hop in there, make your 3 posts, and have those discussions. And what I would encourage you to do is I would post something early on, at least one thing early on, okay? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And then hop in a couple days later and respond to other posts to make sure we're fostering a really good environment for conversation, okay? If everybody waits till the end, there's no conversation, right? And we're ahead. They're going to be ahead of us on the calendar, but we're going to be ahead of them in terms of the content. So it's really useful to post something early. So, between now and, the next couple of days, make your first post, okay? Get a conversation going. And then let it sit for a while and then respond to other people's conversations, okay? And then that should be fine. So next week, this coming week, is a discussion on natural mapping and VR. That's part of the class. Following week is optional, and that's a discussion on moral panics, okay? That's the bonus that's right here.
I have a question about the discussion. If we post like a question we asked it in the lecture to the other people, would that...
That's okay. Yeah, it's totally fine. In fact, I think I'd even suggested that one hack is to post things you've already asked and just post them to a wider audience, right? Now, what you want to do is probably write it a little more conversationally, right? So hey, I was thinking about this and we read about this and here's my question, right? So that's totally fine. You could take the stuff you asked in here, repackage it, and then ask it. Because the written questions we've read, our students who are listening to this now, right? They haven't read those because they're in our server. So you can definitely take those out of Teams and put those in the Moodle if you would like. It's totally fine. Just make sure you customize it to be more conversational. And then, of course, reflect on the things we talked about to open the question up. That's totally fine, though. I'm not going to mark you down if you, ask a question to a broader audience, okay? You wouldn't necessarily need to ask things on video, of course, okay? All right. Any other questions?
So is there something discussion next week, or is this the week after?
Say that again?
So is there after? So next week there's...
Week of the 16th.
Yeah, this coming week is required. That's the discussion of natural mapping. That one is part of class.
Okay.
The one that's on screen is a bonus opportunity for folks who have missed points, and that's 2 weeks from now.
Got it.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So if you're doing both, you would have discussions the next 2 weeks.
And when's our next recording session?
It's at the bottom of this. 1 second, I just closed that. The last one is December 5th.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last one's so I'll make the posts that final week of school, and then the last discussion will be December 5th. Okay. And then there's no discussion for that one. The reason for that is that the class is over. There is a final discussion. This one here, December 7th, is essentially your final exam in the class. So it's during finals week. You have to do one more discussion. Okay. All of this is posted in Teams as well. Okay. And of course, there is no final exam. Basically, you have to finish out the class. Okay. All right. Yeah, there are no exams. Okay. Okay. So the focus this week is on a topic that it's been pretty central to my research for several years now. In fact, I'm kind of looking forward to getting back into this research because it's something that if I go through my career and, you know, different, when we do scholarship, we have these different scholar ratings. So they're almost like leaderboards, and it's essentially how often we've been cited. And the idea behind being cited is that if people are citing your work, it's because they appreciate your scholarship. And so, like, I'm going to put on screen, these are my citation counts that are on here. And there's different numbers, how many times you've been cited overall. This is the number of papers you've written that have been cited at least 10 times. And this is a really hard number to explain, but it's essentially an average number of citations per article, but it sort of throws out your highest and your lowest ones. Reason I'm showing this is if you look at my most cited papers, they often have to do with gaming and meaningful experiences, gaming and need satisfaction, enjoyment and need satisfaction, enjoyment and needs. Like a lot of this research from about 2010 to 2016 was heavily focused on what do games do for people functionally? Like what is their role in our lives, right? And I show that to you, not because those numbers mean a whole lot to anybody in class, but this has been an area of media psychology and communication work that has become intensely popular in recent years. As we shift towards this model of what is the functional role of video games in society. Whereas I think for the longest time, we just focused on them as toys and for children. But of course, moral panic, what's one problem with focusing on them as only for children?
They influence children, and so if you don't know what they are, then you could view them as something that could be causing a negative influence on children.
And you get that us versus them, right? Who are them? The children. Who are us? The responsible adults who care about our children, right? And you get the scenario exactly right where things, you know, clash. But of course, if you do just surface level research, and we could critique these numbers because they do come from industry. Which means they may have some biases in them. But the Electronic Software, Entertainment Software Association every year puts out their sort of state of the industry. And one of the things you'll see is that the average gamer is between 35 and 44. All right? And here's a link to this. If you ever want to use it for like class projects and things like this, it can be a really good resource for data. Again, it is data from the industry, so you know, take it with a grain of salt. But it's not bad. They break down gamer profiles by different gender demographics, family demographics, things like that. But the point I'm making is gamers are older, and they tend to have families. And it kind of makes sense. So if you're 35 to 44, when did you start playing video games?
Probably in the 80s.
Yeah, when the NES hit. And it was the first console that was really popular. And so essentially, folks my age, we just didn't stop gaming. And we played. And we played in the 90s, we played in college, and then we still play. And we're the ones sort of passing it on now to our families. And I point that out because what it might suggest is that if the generation is accepting the technology, maybe that us versus them divide starts to go away. Because now it's no longer them. Because yes, they are children, but they are gamers and we are gamers. So like all of us are gaming. And the reason I point all this out is because there might be sort of a newfound appreciation or acceptance of video games as something that's normal. And it's not something that's abnormal. And so I think like when we were playing, games were kind of weird. It was like, why don't you go outside? And as the games have matured, you know, as the audience has matured, so is the content of the games. And you'll notice today's going to focus a lot more on games than VR. But we're going to hopefully connect this to VR as we get towards the end of the conversation. Yeah.
I know I've played, I just get to talking with people in VR. And I've played with, you know, people who are in their 40s.
Sure.
Like, there's not just, you know, an influx of 12-year-olds because of the Quest 2 and that, but they're definitely all age groups doing VR.
And yeah, I suspect... Oh, go ahead, Javier.
Okay. I told my mom and dad that because I think they would have been surprised. I told them, "What do you think the average age of a gamer is?" And when I told them that, they were like kind of like a look of disappointment or something, and just like I had to tell them I had to tell them like games are not time wasters. They have more applications and like the impact on people than you think.
I'm getting ready to do a study over the break on bridge players online. Like online card players, their average ranges go from 65 to 95. And so go ahead.
I have a question pertaining to the gamers analysis of the average age. So a lot of people would call themselves a gamer, and I'm not trying to geeky, but they would call themselves a gamer when they do things like play Candy Crush on their phone. Is that considering this, or is this like they own a dedicated console to play video games and they sit down and play video games?
So from an industry perspective, they are definitely going to count everybody, right? Because they're going to argue that like games are huge, right? Games are economically viable. Games are culturally relevant. So they are not going to split people up by like hardcores versus console versus PC. Now, if you go through their data, they do have some of that data. They're like, here's how it breaks down. Like this age group plays this game and this age group plays this game, right? Part of course, their focus and their lobbying efforts going to be that everybody plays. And in fact, part of my research would argue the same thing, that what makes this stuff unique is that the more people do it, the less stigmatized it becomes, right? Which gets at the study that I'm doing over the break on bridge players, which most of us would not think bridge is like hardcore gaming. And then you start finding out that some of these bridge players play 12 to 15 hours a week. Like, they play as much as your WoW players, right? And you ask them why they play, and it's socialization, making friends, challenge and competition. So you log into these websites, and they have these like really hardcore ranking systems where you find out like what's your player rank. Some players stream. Like what you start to find out are these like ridiculous commonalities between like this 86-year-old bridge player and then my little brother who streams, Battlefield. And that's going to play a wild role as we go further into this conversation, because one of the things it might suggest is that if more people are touching the activity, there's going to be less potentially us versus theming. So maybe a lot of you asked in our last class, like, how do you push back on moral panics? And one way you do it is remind people that they do the same thing, right? And as Avery pointed out, as you go through those, you'll see some shifts with smartphones. But then again, and I'll be curious to hear our Taiwanese colleagues talk about this, smartphone and mobile gaming in Asia broadly, and in Taiwan in particular, is a massive part of the market. Like, it is the market for gaming. Whereas in the U.S., it's still kind of seen as casual, I feel like. Like, when we see smartphone games, those are casual gamers. You go over to Japan, China, Taiwan, smartphone gaming is everything. Like, it's everywhere.
Here's an interesting little thing I actually learned in regards to mobile use. This is not particularly for gaming, but like in India, most people access the internet through the phone. I think it's like as high as 70%.
There's a lot of areas of the world where this is your computer. Where literally like, that's your console, it's your computer. Like, you don't have a laptop for various reasons. Some of them are infrastructure, right? Alex mentioned, like in Japan, for example, the PC market historically was not very big. It was a console market, right? And of course, in Japan, arcades are still very, very popular. For students who are still going to be here next year, we are hoping to redo our trip to Japan. And the good news is, since we've already done all the paperwork for this last trip, it should just be a matter of handing it over to Tech again and say, okay, here's the paperwork. And that was for the 3-hour class, the pop culture class in Japan. So we're hoping that by 2022, we'll finally be able to travel. We'll see how that goes. So what's on screen right now is the notion of entertainment. Because, of course, if you go back to the earliest definitions of games, they were talked about as toys, as demonstrations. This should be enjoyable for the onlooker, right? They were meant to be gimmicks, and we'll talk about some of that evolution, which you've already said in class a couple of times, but I'm going to reinforce it here in a moment. At the most basic level, when we talk about entertainment, it's sort of an intended media effect that's positive. And we tend to think about this in terms of hedonism. And hopefully somebody gets the reference on screen. Enjoyable, fun. What's that?
Futurama.
Yeah, hedonism bot. Fun, arousing, enjoyable. That's what games are supposed to be. That's what entertainment's supposed to be. It's supposed to be all about fun. And one of the things I'm going to hope to break down today is that the word entertainment is much broader than enjoyment. They're not the same thing. And it's something that we've been working on in a lot of media psychology research over the last about 10 years now to try to make these definitions a little more clean. Kind of like in our discussion around immersion, presence, narrative engagement, this has been another area where we're making real efforts to distinguish these things. This one's become pretty popular even in industry terms. We're starting to really see some movement here. So, go ahead.
I think I might be able to throw my first question in there for a second for one of my questions. Why do many people, especially nowadays, of all time, see video games as purely hedonistic rather than looking at it as something meaningful like a book or a movie? So I would argue that's still a fairly mainstream idea today, even if we're developing more accurate terminology. And there are a lot of games I play that I would argue are more of a work of art rather than just pure entertainment.
So I wonder if you somewhat answered your own question. What do you think, folks?
In my experience, at least, in the past, around the 80s and 90s, a lot of people viewed video games as a negative. They were like, oh, it's rotting your brain. Oh, it's a waste of time. It's only been recently that there's been a notable shift that states video games have meaning and video games can tell a good story and be an art form and everything. Now, of course, there's still dissenters about that.
Of course.
But I feel that we have gone through a shift, a social shift that is pointed towards video games. And it is no longer video games are something for like losers or something. Instead, it's video games are something that people use. It's a valid form of entertainment that everybody does.
And of course, the games you're talking about, Jared, you're also making the assumption that people have played them that aren't just gamers, right? I know a lot of my friends who are film critics have the same problem. They'll talk about films that they've seen that are incredibly deep and rich, but if you don't appreciate film to begin with, you wouldn't watch those movies. And so you get this sort of catch-22. Like, I'm a comic book collector, and I can argue all day about the narrative power of comics, but if you think Batman's silly, you're not going to read, like, the off-the-shelf comic that's in the back of my bookshelf, right? Because it's so far down the rabbit hole that you're not even going to get involved in that thing. I think of a lot of the critiques around anime and sexism, and boy, there's a lot of reasons to say that if we're being really upfront about it. But there's also lots of anime that are ridiculously deep. Like, I still read Full Metal Alchemist, like, every couple of months because it's just this crazy deep story, But I mean, you pick up one Dragon Ball where the old man's grabbing the little girl's chest. And it's like, well, there we go. There's anime for you, right? So, or manga for you. So I suspect, Jared, that has a lot to do with, and I think Avery and Alex both pointed out, the different people in these age groups are playing different things, right? So yes, the average gamer is 35 to 44, but they're not necessarily playing the same game you are. And that might be the rub. In this research I'm hoping to do with these bridge players, one of the things I'm finding out is they don't call it gaming, because that label is still negative. How interesting is that? Like, they play games. Like, I had to convince them that they play video games. They're like, no, I don't. I play bridge. Like, it's a digital game. It's an online game with a community and a score. Like, it's a game. It's what it is, But there's this pushback because to that population, video games are negative. And yet they're playing a video game. Has anybody ever heard of the theory of cognitive dissonance?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's like cognitive dissonance is basically like where you have like basically it's similar like to hypocrisy or whatever. It's where your actions don't match like your beliefs, right? And like you say like, oh, technically, yes, I'm a gamer, but I don't see it that way. You know,
the person who smokes and knows it's bad.
Yeah.
Right.
That kind of
Well, if you smoke and you know it's bad, you got two options. You know, you can either stop smoking or you can convince yourself that it's not bad. And I suspect what goes on is that those gaps have yet to be closed. So it's a fair question. I had scrolled ahead a couple notes to a relatively famous editorial from Roger Ebert. I don't know if anybody knows that name.
Yeah, he was a famous film critic and had a show where he discussed film. Roper, was it like...
Ebert and Roper were the big ones, yeah. And I'm going to share in the chat this actual article, and you can check it out. But he made this relatively impassioned argument that video games could never be art. Like, this is ridiculous. How can this art form possibly be artistic in any way, shape, or form? 2010 wasn't that long ago, right? Mm-hmm. So I suspect a lot of it is cognitive dissonance. And a lot of it is, you know, it goes back to moral panic still. I mean, we still see games implicated in mass shootings, right? And so we still have some of those vestiges of that video game violence debate from the 70s. It is starting to change a little bit. I ended up not asking you to read this article because we didn't get the page proofs posted up on time. But I'm going to share something in the chat, and you can read it when it's ready. It's an open source article. Colleagues of mine from the CDC wrote an article on using video games, violent video games, as a tool for violence prevention. And you can imagine that's not a standard treatment idea, right? And many of our arguments in this paper were based on many of the conversations we're going to have today. But I mean, this was published in, you know, October 2020. So Jared, part of it is the research is only just now breaking out beyond academic journals, right? So it takes a while. First, the researchers are convinced they have something. Then it starts publishing elsewhere. And then eventually other folks catch up on it. I think COVID's going to help because a lot of people are gaming now more than ever before. And so what you're going to see there is just more access and touch to a medium. You know, you got to remember it wasn't last year where we were like, get off your computer, get off your screens. And of course, this year we're like, you should totally get on your screens and live that way, right? So I suspect that's going to change a lot of things as well as people start going, huh, wait a minute. Okay, yeah, I see this. Those are my speculations, you know. But I think most of it's still connected pretty heavily to that moral panic. You know, there's just more negative news about games in VR than there is positive news. You know,
I think on the road of the using video games to for violence prevention, I can. That's something I kind of see because, you know, for however many thousands of years, you know, humanity has been kind of tribal and, you know, killing each other, and there's probably some biological thing with, you know, having battles as, you know, with your group or whatever, and gaming might sort of fill that.
So the argument that we put forward actually, well, I'm going to come back to it because it's going to come up in actually our conversations today because I don't want to get too far ahead of defining eudaimonia before we talk more about the topic. But those are my quick answers. I think it's more along the lines of a lack of exposure and more along the lines of cognitive dissonance when you actually have the exposure. Right? I'm going to pull us out of games a little bit and talk about the broader concept. So we know that not every piece of media that we consume is inherently enjoyable from a hedonic perspective, right? Enjoyment's not always adaptive. It's not always good to be happy. You know, we do know that it is not it's okay to not be happy 24/7, that there are adaptive reasons why you might need to be sad or empathetic or pensive or quiet every once in a while, right? So this whole thing of like everyone yelling at you when you're not smiling, it's actually not all that great. Like you don't just need to walk around happy all the time. We know that, at least in film, there's a long history of sad films being incredibly popular. You know, some of the most highly rated and most successful films of all time are not happy. You know, I mean, Citizen Kane is largely considered by many critics to be one of the greatest films ever made. It ends horribly. Like, it's sad and like, oh, it's hard. Has anybody seen it? I'm just curious.
Yes.
Yeah, like it doesn't end. Like, nobody wins that I can remember. I don't think anybody wins in Citizen Kane. It's just this sad tragedy of this guy breaking himself. It's Orson Welles' sort of greatest achievement, right? And it doesn't end on a happy note. And actually, Javier, now that I'm thinking about it, I can't think of a point in Citizen Kane where there's like a happy note, because from the very beginning, this guy's kind of a jerk, and you're just watching this jerk win, and you kind of want him to lose. And then he loses, and you feel bad for him. Does that sound more or less like the movie?
I mean, the film basically starts off with his parents giving him away, right?
Yeah. Like, you feel bad for a guy who ends up being a huge ass, and then you kind of want him to lose, and then he loses, and you're like, oh, you poor dude. Like, it's not your fault. It's not your fault, right? And if you haven't seen Citizen Kane, it really is pretty amazing. It's long, and it doesn't have a lot of action, so it kind of heads up there. I don't know if this video is going to play for us all right. Let's see if it does.
So it's just right this way, right in here.
Oops, sorry.
So it's just right this way, right in here. This is it. There are more rooms down the hall, too. And can you explain just what you guys do here? Oh, sure. This is the Pixar Sad Lab. Yeah, we work on discovering new ways of making our audiences cry as much as possible. It's like the Human Genome Project, but instead of mapping DNA, we're trying to make people sob so hard that they lose their shit. Oh yeah, we're trying to make people real sad on purpose.
Tissue sample?
So we're constantly researching characters and storylines in order to maximize sadness potential.
How do you guys feel about a rabbit who can't hear very well?
That's sad.
A boy who's reunited with his dog that he thought was dead. Sad. Sad balloon.
That's kind of sad.
Color yellow.
That's sad.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
We found that our ideal formula to really get audiences tear-jerking is to ambush them. For instance, when you're watching Up, you're thinking it's a kid's movie, what could go wrong? The balloons, and then wham! Miscarriage and a dead wife.
Can we make the eyes a little bit bigger? Okay. Oh, this is good. I am feeling very bad for this guy. Oh, he is very sad. Let's make a movie. I'm Eric, lead researcher on character development. Like, Nemo's weird fin? This guy? That was me. I'd say a big breakthrough came with Monsters, Inc. We developed a scene in the end where Sully's tucking the little girl into bed, and she says, "Kitty." And Sully says, "Kitty has to go now." Yeah, that was our moon landing.
And that's the break room, if you need a break. And in here's the music analysis part. You can't go in there. Well, when I see someone walk out of a Pixar movie and their face is swollen, their nose is raw, I get to say, I did that to them.
And because now we're like super rich.
Oh yeah.
And of course, what are they playing at here, right?
I mean, they're playing at, I mean, I totally get it when they were showing the Toy Story 3 scene, you know, when they're about to go into the fire.
Oh,
I totally remember crying with that. And even my mom was, like, I think it was all family, and we were tearing up. It was a very sad moment. But like, no, it can't end like this.
Like, we all know, like, that the Pixar's thing is, like, at some point in their movies, they're going to try to punch you in the gut, right? Why would they do that?
Probably some kind of bigger takeaway from the film.
Sure.
Than just you know, happiness. You know,
Yeah,
something to make you think about.
There's a lot more to storytelling than smiling, right? And authentic stories are hard. And we talked about narrative engagement already a little bit. And, like, those things are tough. Like, to really get someone to be in a story connected to characters, well, at some point there's going to be a tragic arc, right? And if you're trying to teach a lesson, which almost every children's show in particular, there's usually some kind of built-in lesson to these things, right? They're basically 2-hour-long fables, right? You don't learn unless you suffer, right? And of course, these are pretty popular movies. I think we could generally agree that even if one person here didn't like one of them, you know, Wall-E, The Incredibles, Finding Nemo, Monsters, Inc., and Toy Story have all done very, very, very well. And there's a paradox there that why would we like negative content? Like, content that feels bad. And of course, we know it can lead to empathy, perspective taking, can make stories more real, and things like this, right? To your average audience, this doesn't seem like a paradox, but it does from a research perspective when we think about entertainment. And it used to be defined as something a little more basic, is enjoyment. But that's not what we're going for, right? So when we're talking about these concepts, one of the things we've started to see is a split between hedonic happiness, pardon me, which might be pleasure, arousal, positive feelings, maximizing pleasure, and eudaimonic happiness, self-expression, self-realization, personal development, contemplation. If anybody's ever seen the comedy and drama mask, right? This is kind of what we're talking about. There's comedies that are uplifting, and there are dramas that pull us down, and they both play a role in the larger entertainment structures. Phil mentioned the ambush thing. Yeah, it did kind of feel like that. Hey, here's a cute old man who's got balloons, and that's neat, and holy God, what is happening right now? And, I mean, I don't recall another children's show that dealt with miscarriages. Like, that's tough, you know?
Yeah. And a lot of film, like a video essays on YouTube, to just talk about the first few minutes about the most powerful section of it.
Yeah, there's been some discussions around this. Like, if you want to build a character really fast, this is a lesson on how you do that, and then how you make it real, right? One of the things that we've shifted to then, so if enjoyment and entertainment aren't the same thing, right? Well, then what are they? And so we argue that enjoyment has a complement in appreciation. And appreciation is more that eudaimonic happiness. So enjoyment would be the hedonic focus, pleasure, fun, arousal. And appreciation would be the eudaimonic approach. Meaning of life, inspiration, compassion, introspection. And both of them play a role in entertainment. Okay? They both have different effects. I think Jared had asked if they could be correlated, and I'll show some data on that later. The short answer is they are.
Actually.
Yeah. They are orthogonal, meaning that they are, they are orthogonal concepts, meaning they are separate concepts, but they can be correlated. So it's not like if you have one, you can't have the other. They can coexist, but they don't have to coexist. You can have one without the other. You can have both. You can have one higher than the other. That's actually an area of research that has, to be honest, I don't think has been really well defined. And one of the problems, not with your question, but with the research, enjoyment tends to be more immediate reaction, whereas appreciation tends to be more of like a lagged reaction, if that makes any sense. So I might watch Schindler's List. I don't enjoy that movie. But as I think about it, I appreciate that movie. But there could also be games like Pixar movies where I watch the Pixar movie, I really enjoy it, and then as I think about it more, I appreciate it too. We don't know or think that one causes the other, in part because they deal with very different things. The triggers for enjoyment and the triggers for appreciation are thought to be very separate. And we'll talk about some of those later on in the class. But I do think it's an area of research. And the reason I keep pointing that out to everybody on the call is whether you're on campus for another year, thinking about grad school, thinking about careers, whenever I say something like that's open for research, what I'm really saying is we should research that. That these could be good theses projects, independent study projects, capstone projects. These could go in lots of directions because we don't actually have some of these answers yet. But it is generally thought to be that they don't cause each other because they have different causes in and of themselves. Now, a good film may have both, right? You may have some really good action stuff and some really good narrative stuff, and then I both enjoyed and appreciate it. But later on, I'm going to show you a data model that tries to separate them out. But it's an open question, right? What's on screen is some of the ways we measure these things. Now, this one is a bit dated. It's focused on film, and it tends to be more about a trait. And so Oliver and Rainey were arguing that audiences may have sort of a predisposition towards watching stuff that's more enjoyable versus watching stuff that's more appreciated. Okay? And then we're going to see some of those things, right? And I'm going to come back to Jared's more specific question when we get to that path model down the road. So if you look at some of these items, I like movies that challenge my way of seeing the world. I like movies that make me more reflective. I like movies that focus on the human condition, making me think, searching for understanding, having a profound meaning. All of those items definitely seem to be measuring like appreciation. And in fact, if you look at this, it's okay if you don't understand these numbers. These are factor scores, and the general idea is these ones are really strong and these ones are really weak. So all of these things kind of group together. And then you had this other side of things. I want to have fun. I want to laugh. I want to enjoy myself. I like movies that are silly or shallow. I like movies that are positive. I think the entertainment one's a problem because it confuses the definition. These all seem to be more like arousal, fun, things like that. And so this study was one of the first ones that tried to tease out like people having a preference for one or the other. And it has some limitations, right? It was done on students. And of course, student samples may not replicate with other movie audiences, right? It was done in the US. And one of the reasons that could be a problem is that there could be cultural underpinnings to eudaimonia versus hedonism that other cultures don't have, right? We know, for example, in some cultures that are a bit more, have more of a dualistic approach to the world, balance, to where we don't think about things in terms of good and evil. We just think about things in terms of different sides. So like a yin-yang, for example, if you're thinking about like balance of dark and light, it's not that weird to have both. So, in the U.S., a morally ambiguous character is one that makes us think more and is a bit more surprising. But in other cultures, what you find out is morally ambiguous characters don't really stand out that much because the whole culture is about balancing, dark and light. And there's some research out of South Korea on this if you're interested in learning more about that. But these are some early attempts to try to measure people's dispositions towards these different kinds of content. Just to give you an idea of where this research came from. And, the question that Jared asked earlier comes up here again, can games be serious, right? And I linked the article to you from Roger Ebert where he says definitively not. Like, they can't be an art form. You can't appreciate a game. That's not how they work. And I suspect when you read that article, you'll see a lot of vestiges, not necessarily of moral panic. He didn't seem to be trashing the medium, but more along the lines of, like, it can't be serious. Like, that's not serious. Yeah. Or, like, just in... Denial is a good word for it. Yeah, I guess it is a good word for it. Just denying it up front. Like, nope, can't be. Let's move on. This is a silly discussion, right? But of course, I can share some examples. I don't know if anybody played this when it came out or has played it recently, but what's happening in this scene?
Sephiroth is killing Aerith and Cloud Founder.
Yeah, like, and in this game, if I remember correctly, so the original PS game was stretched across 3 CDs. And this was at the very end of the first CD. And, you know, Final Fantasy VII, if you've played it before, one of the things that made it pretty unique was that it was very cinematic. Like, there was a lot of, you'd play for a while, and then they would, the developers integrated a lot of cinema-style cutscenes into the game. So it was presented to you in more of this, like, epic way. I don't want to give away too much about the plot if you're playing it or playing the remake, but, you know, Ares is a really important character. You kind of stumble across her a bit on accident in the game. And it turns out she has this, like, really deep hidden power inside of her that you sort of slowly uncover and you slowly kind of understand. There's a little bit of, like, romantic ambiguity between you and her. And it's never quite clear, but, like, there's this sort of romantic tension there. And she was a playable character, right? You could put her in your party if you wanted to. You didn't have to. But she was pretty powerful if you did put her in your party. She was also kind of one of the famous squishy characters, right? Takes a lot of damage, but can deal a lot of damage through magic, or not magic in the game, but if you play it, you get the point. Well, she gets stabbed by the main villain through the back and dies. And that's not how RPGs worked. Like, characters don't die in video games. In fact, in Final Fantasy VII, what do you do if a character dies?
You res them with a Phoenix Stone.
You give them a potion, and you probably had like 80 of these in your pocket. Like, if you were going into the end of the battles in the first game, you probably stocked up on Phoenix Down just in case. So, and any other time in this game when someone dies, you just give them a potion, and they pop back to life, right? And suddenly she's dead. And it was weird. It was really weird. And the game, if you remember this, the narrative pivots around this scene. The narrative pivots. In fact, the gameplay pivots pretty quickly, because not too long after this, if I'm not mistaken, is when you finally go out and you're out in the world and you're finally moving on. Like, Midgard is kind of in your past now. If you were using this character, you just put a lot of time and money into this person, and suddenly she's gone. Now, if I'm not mistaken, well, I don't want to spoil anything, but point here is that a lot of gamers, like, this one hit them pretty hard. And this game was sort of credited with, like, an early approach at that real gut punch. Like, that real, like, it would not have been weird to maybe have even cried at this scene. And if you remember, Alex, the scene's kind of stretched out for a while. There's some dialogue. There's some cinematics. I think at one point, Alex, Cloud puts her back in the pool, and you see her, like, ceremonially returning to the earth. And there's even, like, a release, I think, of mana at one point. And it gets tough, right? And if you played this game, all of those things are critical to the plotline. And so it's a meaningful death. And without this meaningful death, the narrative works very differently, right? I think I've talked about this one in class already, and I think that other people have mentioned this one as well. But if anybody's played Spec Ops: The Line, this was another one where a game, talk about being ambushed. All of a sudden, you're pinned down by enemy fire. You realize you've got a white phosphorus grenade in your pack, which white phosphorus grenades aren't really supposed to be weapons. They're for marking territory. But white phosphorus will when it contacts human skin, combusts, so it can be used as a weapon. And if you remember this scene, Walker, the main character, pulls out the grenade, and one of your colleagues stops you. And he's like, "Do you know what that is?" And he's like, "Yeah, I know what it is." He's like, "That's white phosphorus." And you get this sort of like dissent lecture from your underlings, like, "You can't do that." And I think the famous line is like, something about a choice being made, and Walker says something like, "We don't have a choice," and then one of your characters goes, "There's always a choice." Now, of course, in the game, you don't get to make a choice. You launch it, and you drop the grenade on. And in fact, if you remember, anybody play this game? On this level, you actually like drive the grenade towards the like point of maximal impact. It goes off. Go to what you jump over the wall. You walk through the battlefield, and the first thing you notice is that people are speaking in English, and that's a little weird because in this game, your enemies, at least in the beginning, weren't fellow U.S. soldiers. They're also not dead. Phil, I think you had indicated you had played this before. Like, what's happening? Oh, you did? Okay. As you're walking through the battlefield, they're not dead. They're writhing and they're screaming at you. And one guy reaches up and he's like, "Why? Why did you do it?" And then you start finding out that not only was there are they fellow U.S. soldiers, but there's also civilians involved in the crowd. And you find out really quickly that this was a group of soldiers who were trying to escort refugees out of the city, and you just dropped a grenade on them. And as you get closer to like ground zero, you start realizing that they're dead. And there's a scene where there's a woman holding her child, and they're both burnt. And when they modeled those scenes, they used footage from real white phosphorus attacks. And so it's pretty gruesome. It's pretty intense. And what you're seeing right now on screen is the main character realizes what happened. And the two in the back are your colleagues. And one of them's like, "You just turned me into a murderer." And they start pushing each other. And then Walker's face, like, what does that look tell us?
It's a look of like deep realization of what just happened.
Like, I don't know what just happened. And if anybody who's played this game,
I have not, but I actually did buy it in a Steam sale for like $7, and I'm gonna get around to playing it at some point.
Give it a shot. The whole game follows this character's kind of slow mental decline. And Walt Williams, who was the writer of this game, talked a lot about that was kind of his point. He wanted to make a game about war and about violence that contextualized it all. And by contextualizing it, it kind of gave the player a very different perspective. Because if you've played it, the game otherwise is a pretty decent game. Like, it's a fairly good third-person shooter. It's got good mechanics. The battle system's pretty good. And, of course, it starts off like any other third-person shooter. You shoot things. And then you shoot more things. And then you advance. And then you shoot things. Well, as you go through the game, you get hit with these decisions. And if I remember correctly, this was one of the first heavy ones. Where you're like, wow, this is different. And then it only gets more intense from here. The game has several endings. They almost all involve Walker losing his mind in some way. And talk about being ambushed. It wasn't really sold that way. Yeah, Matt talked about it's basically Heart of Darkness, if you haven't seen that movie. It's a very similar approach, where it's just like, I want to show you how tough this stuff is. And he gave a talk at the GDC, the Game Developers Conference. I'll see if I can pull it up here real quick. We're not going to watch it. It's way too long. But I believe it is, oh yeah, it's called We Are Not Heroes, Contextualizing Violence. And I had the pleasure of being able to attend this one live. And he and I have formed a little bit of a friendship since then. Give that a watch on your own time. It's an interesting discussion of the development behind this game. And the idea of making a video game about war that could tell like an anti-war message. Not by having players actually do bad things and then seeing the consequences of their actions. Right. It's an interesting one. And I believe the game has largely gotten pretty good ratings for the most part. Like, it was fairly well celebrated. It was fairly well known. He still is a writer for 2K Games, I believe. But this was another one where it was like, huh. So, like, these two really hit me pretty hard. And I'm thinking of my gaming experiences. The only other one I can think of that I would throw on this list, has anybody played Journey before? Journey was one that the ending surprised me. Alex, what happens in the end of that game?
It's been a while since I played it. I can't tell you.
No worries. If you get back into it again, you just sort of end. You're walking up the mountain. So the whole game, it's never quite clear what you're supposed to do, right? Like, you're compelled to walk in this direction. And there's like some platform puzzles, and the game is intentionally ambiguous. If you remember, like you just sort of, you're there, you exist, and you hear different visions and things of this nature. You're often walking, it's a long walk through the desert, right? And there's a lot of these like icons and symbols that suggest you should be going somewhere. There really is, if I'm not mistaken, Alex, at no point is there voice or anything of that interaction or anything like that.
No.
You're just
it's all
going.
nonverbal.
Yeah, you're just going, and there's symbols and signs throughout the game that kind of encourage you to continue on. And then towards the very end, you're walking up this mountain. I'm trying to find... You're heading towards this light, basically throughout the entire game. And as you get to the end, you're hiking up the mountain, and then you just disappear. And, like, that's it. And when I played it, and I was like, what? What just happened? And it starts over again if you want to play it again. And, of course, it's about the journey. But it was a wild game in that it didn't... You had to tell the entire narrative to yourself. And it was one of these unexpected experiences where there really was no payoff. There was no reward. There was no win. There was never, like, an object I got or a score or a... You know, you satisfied the journey simply by completing it, right? It came out of this series of flow-inducing games where the whole idea was to kind of just keep your attention and keep you moving throughout the process. I know I've talked about some of this before, but I want to reinforce it. So, to answer Jared's question from earlier, I think that these experiences are still pretty... contained to a certain set of gamers, right? By nature of the games that are being played. And it's still taking a while for folks to realize that, oh yeah, that could also happen in video games. That could also happen in video games. You know, this could be used in a military history class if you wanted to. It's not there yet, right? This could be used in a high school, literature class. We're not quite there yet. Have you seen this slide before? I'm trying to recall if I've talked about this information or not, because I teach a couple of different courses that talk about the similar material. I'll dive into it, and if somebody's like, I think we've heard this, we'll speed up. I know the next couple you will have. A lot of folks think that what you see on screen is probably the very first video game, although some folks contest that it was a video game, in part because it didn't involve any computational abilities. This is from the Brookhaven National Lab. I just put a link to the story. It was Tennis for Two, the tennis game. And it's basically an oscilloscope where you can manipulate the knobs to manipulate how the waves on the screen bounced around. And they made it look like you were hitting a tennis ball. It was developed by the Brookhaven National Lab because people were visiting the lab and they wanted them to be interested in stuff. And not everybody's interested in science. And they thought that maybe if we made like a toy to play with, people would think that's neat. And they did, by the way. It was very popular. It didn't teach a lick about science or computers or engineering, but it was neat to play with, right? Fast forward a little further. Can you see that GIF playing okay? That GIF playing okay? This is a game called Space War. This is considered the first video game ever. It was developed at MIT by a group of computer scientists who had just gotten a brand new computer called the PDP-1. And they were trying to figure out basically what it can do. And so here's an example of what a PDP-1 looks like. This is the monitor and then the various pieces that go with it to make it run. And essentially they wanted to find out, like, what can you do with this thing? Like, how do we tax this thing to see what it can handle? And you're probably familiar with, like, these room-sized computers, right? And they came up with this sort of, it's not a real theory, it's a tongue-in-cheek theory of computer toys. Again, that name toy is coming back, right? They wanted to find out that the best way to tax this computer, first we wanted to design a program that can demonstrate all of the computer's resources. We want to show people what this baby can do, right? Let's show people what a computer can do. let's make it interesting, meaning every time you turn it on, it does something unique, right? Most computations don't work that way. You put in the data, it runs the analysis, gives you the result. It doesn't do it a different way each time. That would be insane. And they wanted to make sure it was pleasurable and fun, because they were trying to show off these new devices and what they do for us and why they matter. They wanted it to be a game, right? If you haven't played Space War before, you can play it online. I want to say that a couple of you mentioned you had played it, like in browsers and stuff like that. And there's all sorts of different websites, like the one I'll share right now, that will let you play Space War. This one is probably one of the more accurate ones to the original game, so you're welcome to jump on that. Again, most of us don't debate that video games are fun. I mean, nobody really argues that side of things. We know that core motivations for gaming are being in control, right? Pushing the buttons and making things happen. The whole idea of a video game and what might make it superior to a film or some other form of media is its interactivity, that you get to actually play an active role in how this thing works. And we generally recognize that. We talked about in week 1, the idea of managing demands, that, you know, video games are interesting, is that they put all of these cognitive, actually, what were the 4 sources of demand? A quick little like quiz type thing. There are these 4. Go ahead.
I said social is 1. Social demand.
Social's 1.
Physical?
Physical's another. Social, physical. Cognitive, yeah. Social, physical, cognitive, one more.
Emotional.
Emotional, right? And so one of the conversations is that they put all of these demands on you sort of simultaneously. You've got to think through the puzzles. You have these affective reactions to the content. You've got to literally manipulate the controls, and you have to make things happen while you're thinking about the puzzles and while you're reacting to the people on screen. And then you've got the social elements, right? Because you have not only other players, but also the characters you form relationships with. And so the idea is that these different sources of demand have a pretty dramatic impact on how you experience the game. And of course, those aren't unique to video games, but some of them are. For example, the physical, right? That's not one you would find in other forms of media. How many of you have heard of the idea of flow states before? I know it gets thrown around a lot when we talk about video games. The general notion here, and it's on screen, is that whenever we're talking about autotelic activities, these are activities that you engage in for your own motivation. What we often see happening is that there's 2 dimensions. There is the challenge the activity provides to you, right? And then there's your skill or your ability to meet that challenge. That sounds, you know, whether you're rock climbing or playing baseball or playing a video game, those things exist, right? Well, systems that are too challenging, where the challenge is greater than your skill, probably just induce anxiety and frustration. And systems that you're really good at, that don't present much of a challenge, probably induce boredom, right? You're really, really, really good, and the thing you're doing is so far beneath your skills, it's just not interesting. And so the notion of a flow state is a scenario in which you're kind of right in the middle of these 2 things, where the system's challenges are balanced to your skill. So if you don't have a whole lot of skill, you're going to want a low-level challenge. And if you have a lot of skill, you're going to want a pretty beefy and decent challenge. And as you can imagine, in a good interactive system, these 2 things scale with each other. Anybody here who's played video games knows this, right? As you play through, the game sort of implicitly teaches you things in the early stages that you'll use for later stages. And a really good game, every once in a while will blip where the challenge is greater than your skill. So you recognize these red dots. Those are your classic like boss fights or end of level fights or end of chapter moments where the balance gets thrown off, where they pull the challenge up. So the challenge is a little higher than your skill. Because when you beat that challenge, right, you start to reinforce those skills, and then the game pulls you back up again. And it's this very classic stair-step method. And you see this in a lot of systems design, especially for game design, right? If you don't have this stair-step method, you lose your players too quickly, either because the game never gets any harder, or it starts off so hard from the get-go that you never have the ability to tackle the game. In fact, there are some one-off games that play with this. Like, where would Dark Souls fit into here?
Up.
Yeah. Yeah, up. Like, that's the point of the game, right? It's a brutal game. Like, it's become its own genre, right? Because the whole point of that game maximally attacks you from the get-go, right? And it takes a certain motivation to want to continue playing. And it's a fun part of the game, right? It's like, I know this thing's hard. In fact, it's so hard, I'm not going to feel bad if I lose, because that's part of the game, right? Some people have written about failure in games is a learning mechanism. You know, if you think about many video games, failing is part of the equation. You know, you fail, then you learn for the future. Flappy Bird often was put on here, where very quickly it got very hard. And of course, it was a survival game. How long can you play before this thing is just too much, right? And of course, can you think of examples of games that might be more over here, where the challenge is really low, but they somehow ended up not being boring games?
There are games like Animal Crossing or Stardew Valley.
So let's talk about that, right? That seems to break the model. So one of the things neat about this model is only predicting enjoyment. But maybe what happens is that a game like Animal Crossing isn't supposed to be exciting. It's not about defeating a challenge. What's the point of Animal Crossing?
Pay off your house.
Pay off your house, right? Relax, meet friends, talk to people online. It's a bit of an RPG, right? Like, it's not meant to lose. And if there's lots of games like that where you don't lose the game, and in fact, one might even argue that if Animal Crossing had a lot of these different challenges, it wouldn't be the same game anymore. I mean, how frustrating is an RPG where you can't see the next chapter? Like, at some point, I don't care anymore. Like, I don't want to watch a movie that's so hard that as I'm watching the movie, I can't get to the next chapter because I can't understand what's going on, right? This model is really good for predicting enjoyment, but it may not work so well for predicting appreciation. And in fact, you may have to think of a very different model if you want your video game to be something that is going to be more reflective, right? It's going to be hard to tell an anti-war message if I can't get to that level, right? This game's got a deep narrative for you, but you can't get there, so all you're going to know is that this game's hard, you keep falling in a pit of spikes. It's going to be a challenge, because, like, who's played Heavy Rain before? You know,
I know of it.
Heavy Rain's a deeply narrative game, right? But you can't really lose. Like, Alex, how does the action work in Heavy Rain?
It's all quick time events.
Yeah.
Everything is a quick time event. There's
You just
no
push 'em.
actual, like, mechanical skill.
How does that work in terms of demand? What are they trying to do there to balance out those demands? So the left here is Heavy Rain, where
they're trying to make it so that you feel like the consequences of failing an in-time event, like something you're surprised about.
Right, but in terms of the demands of the game itself, which ones are they making really high and which ones are they making really low? Like, if you compare these two images, which one of these games is higher in physical demand?
Definitely Street Fighter.
Right, you've got to be action, 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 action the whole way. Whereas you can see, like, on this one, they've made the physical part very, very easy. You just push a button, right? Because which one of these games is likely more narratively driven?
Heavy Rain.
Probably Heavy Rain. So what what you're saying, that kind of makes sense, right? Like, I don't want you so focused on the controls that you aren't as focused on the emotions. There's not really a cognitive puzzle to solve right now. You just push one of these buttons, right? Over here, there's a, you know, if anybody here is particularly good at fighting games, you almost see them like chess matches. Like you're trying to think in advance and anticipate your opponent's moves and think of a move ahead of time. There's a heavy cognitive element there that you don't really have over here. This one's probably much more focused on the low physical demand, low cognitive demand, and probably really high emotional demands, and maybe even really high social demands because you care about these characters. I'm not particularly attached to Ken and Ryu when I'm playing this game. Doesn't mean you can't be. It's just that that's not the design focus, right?
Well, that's basically like the focus of all, like the Heavy Rain example. That's basically like the focus for most Telltale games.
Right. They're made that way on purpose. They don't follow this design because they're not going for enjoyment. I don't need a stagger step boss step. It doesn't need to work that way. But the problem is, if you don't have any of this, the big critique is it's not a video game. And so, Alex, maybe you're familiar with that. A lot of folks like Heavy Rain, but then a lot of folks critique it for not being a video game. Like, yeah, but it's just a push buttons.
It's its own category. It's known as a David Cage game, which is the creator of the game, like the producer of the game or director. His style of games always have that kind of system, which is quick time events lead the gameplay and everything.
We used to call them
narrative focused.
We used to call them interactive narratives in the 90s, and there were lots of them. So like when the old Sega CD came out, they were basically Sega CD games were basically interactive movies. Right? You would play the game and you would make a choice and then the cinema would play out. Riley's asking about whether or not it's like Bandersnatch. No, because Bandersnatch, you couldn't interact with it like immediately. Like in Heavy Rain, you're literally, as you go through, you're interacting with this thing. You know, Bandersnatch would be more like the interactive narratives we saw back in the 90s, right? But it's a similar concept of interacting with the narrative as it goes, right? So this part becomes really interesting because we can start thinking about kind of how we go through and play with these different concepts. Okay.
I can think of a possible other example of a game that's not challenging, but not challenging in a certain way, like in regards to gameplay.
Yeah.
But that is fun, and that a lot of people find fun watching. Among Us.
Sure, walk through it though, because you know.
Among Us, I'm pretty sure most of us know that game because it's pretty much like one of the biggest games of the year now. I mean, the tasks you have to do in the game are not hard. You know, it's like, oh, connect these wires, done. Turn this knob, done, and stuff. Gameplay-wise, it's not hard at all. The more of the challenge comes around from figuring out who the imposter is. It's more of it's high cognitive demand because you have to really think about everyone's story. Okay, does it line up of this? There's an inconsistency here or whatever. So it's a game where gameplay is not challenging, but it's still, but where it challenges you cognitively, you know, to figure out who the imposter is and you got to get them off the ship.
Well, and some of those, right, has a heavy social element, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we thought that demand model kind of plays around with this a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. So all of this is useful, but for a particular type of game. Mm-hmm. And of course, this you have seen, but I do want to go over it again to make sure we're on the same page. We know that media follow these really similar evolutions, right? So we know, for example, that the earliest films were demonstrations, just playing around with technology to see how things work. You know, taking pictures and making them move. And then we shifted over to, you know, okay, let's put a camera in front of a stage. And then that was just showing types of entertainment that we already had available to us. And then over here in the far end, it was, what happens if you use more than one camera? You know, the idea of editing film was not natural. They took a while to figure that out. Like, you could shoot multiple scenes with different cameras, cut the films, put them back together, and tell an entirely different story. Right? And all of these things were kind of playing a role in the evolution of the medium. Riley, my guess is this is probably compiled differently on screen here. But actually, the earliest film, I mean, this whole thing, I think it only had 16 frames. So this was like hand cut and stacked and put together. He was asking about how getting it steady. But I'm going to suspect that's just more of a artifact of the GIF being made. So the point here, of course, is that if you would have asked somebody in the 1800s if film would have been serious for telling stories, we would have said no. That's crazy. Like, you don't tell stories with movies. You shoot things moving and running and walking around, right?
Yeah, that's the thing about in regards to like what's interesting about I haven't read it yet, but the Roger Ebert article about video games and VR is like, well, back in the early days of film, it was not considered art either.
Not at all.
Spectacle.
Yeah, the earliest films were not artistic and not respected. They were considered like, oh, that's a neat diversion, but I don't care about that, right? You go to you put a nickel in a thing and like see a girl take her shirt off, and like that was a film, or you know, it was not respected. It took a long time for the developers of movies to learn how to shoot different movies in different ways, to where we eventually got to the wide tapestry of films that we have today. And I'm going to suspect, I mean, the first things written weren't narratives. I mean, like, writing probably took a long time to evolve, you know? Photography took a long time to evolve. These media evolutions are remarkably similar. Even though the technologies are totally different, and even though the time periods are different, the evolutions seem to be demonstration of like, hey, this thing can do stuff. Replication to, hey, the stuff that we're already familiar with, we can do with this medium too. And then finally, extension being, oh, we can do something totally new with this medium that we couldn't do with any other media before it. And of course, with games, we see mostly the same thing. Remember, the PDP-1 Space War was defined as a demonstration. That's all it was. It was just meant to be fun, to play with, to have a good time with. It meant nothing. It was really just there to show off the computer, and that's pretty much it, and we didn't otherwise care that much about it. And then a replication. Same old story. Something, something, something princess, something, something, something hero. Right? It wasn't really an innovative story to tell with Mario. And then, of course, we get to extension, and we've already talked about this game, right? Okay, you're in an airport, you're a terrorist, and I want you to shoot those civilians. Which, we've seen that in films before, right? Where terrorists take something over, but we never had to pull the trigger before.
Right.
And now all of a sudden, it's like, oh, hey, by the way, you're going to go ahead and murder those people. And these are the evolutions that we're seeing that might get back to Jared's original question. Why is it folks don't take this seriously? Well, much of it is that we don't recognize these histories. And like Javier pointed out so well with this example, you know, there could have been a Roger Ebert of 1880 who wrote the same exact editorial about newfangled films. Like, no movie will ever replace a book. Right? And then they did. And then it wasn't a problem at all. When I was in elementary school, it was still considered kind of weird to watch a movie in school. Like, why aren't you having the kids read? And that stereotype has kind of gone away a little bit. It's not weird to watch. I remember we watched a movie in my English class, and the English teacher took a lot of heat for that. And they were like, why are you showing them movies? You know, they should be reading books. And we watched The Outsiders and West Side Story, and I forgot the third one. Incidentally, she did have us read the book too. That was part of her lesson, was like, read the book and then watch the film, right? But that was considered weird. But I think if you were to go fast forward to a modern education, it doesn't seem all that strange to watch a film in a literature class. Like films are considered
tablets in elementary schools now.
Well, right, and of course the tablets can be used for all sorts of different things. I'm trying to divorce the medium from the content, right. But the general, because I could read a book on a tablet too, but nonetheless, if you go to a library today, you'll find an extensive film catalog. I know some of you are from Lubbock. Does the local library have films?
Like I used to get graphic novels there a lot. I haven't been in a long time though.
Does anybody know if it has movies, like DVDs? My guess is it does.
Probably. I mean, when I was at South Plains College, they had movies in the library.
Yeah, I suspect Tech does as well. I know in Morgantown, honestly, the library, like the Morgantown Municipal Library's collection of films was like better than any other store in town. Like it was just, you got better movies like at the library, right? And in part because they're part of the scene now. It's and of course we have librarians on the call, or folks who work over there. Like it's not weird to have film. Riley said graphic novels. Phil's talking about Cincinnati. Like you go to the public library in Cincinnati, and they've got like a pretty awesome not only film collection but like on-demand film collection. Like this is not something that's all that strange anymore. But I suspect those conversations going back decades did not always go this way. We're like, what do you mean we're going to spend our budget on Disney movies? Like, no way we're going to do that. That's crazy. And now it's just not a problem to do something like that because we go through these medium. But I've never seen a library, maybe I'm wrong, that has video games for rent or for checkout. Right? That's kind of interesting. Like I can't think of a library.
I have. I'm pretty sure that Arizona Library has it.
Has video games?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you know more about that? Like, do they rent consoles, tape? I'm curious about that.
I've actually heard of libraries that rent consoles. Let me look some stuff up.
If you wouldn't mind, Koji, that'd be awesome. Because that would be a cool example of getting to Jared's question about, like, one marker could be, well, if we think about libraries being, and Riley's talking about GameFly, but Riley, my point isn't whether or not you can rent it. What I'm getting at more is the idea of respecting it to the point where it's seen as a public good, right? If you think about most libraries being an access point for the public to better understand and appreciate the knowledge around them and these different products, it says a lot that public libraries start allowing folks to check out games. Phil just posted something on Reddit. Avery talked about some of the military bases. That's pretty cool. And that might start suggesting like, oh yeah, they're just part of our structures, right?
Yeah. The library in my town actually used to let us rent out consoles and games, and
that's wild.
I would just go there every week and get a new game.
And I'm thinking about like, I wonder how parents responded to that originally, like when the library first started buying video games. I would love to know those stories. Like for these libraries you're all talking about, I would love to know like the debates within the library staff, and then also the debates with like the shareholders and the taxpayers, because you can see that. I mean, you got to remember, there's a lot of libraries that get in trouble for having Harry Potter, right? Because it teaches witchcraft. So then you go up to like, well, here's the interactive game, right? Matt Online's talking about the graphic novel collection at Tech, and I do know about that one. It's pretty cool. That one's really cool. At Michigan State, they had a massive they had a massive comic collection, and they also had a massive video game collection, but it wasn't video games, it was video game documentation. So like advertisements, manuals, and things of that nature. And of course, Jared's asking the question like, when does VR come? And that's kind of where I'm going, right? Like, these are interesting cultural markers of when something is considered valuable. And of course, one thing that libraries play a major role in is making things more democratized and increasing accessibility, right? So beyond just the cultural discussion of what it means at the grand level, there's the discussion of, allowing folks to access those things, right? And Riley, to be clear, the debate's not about whether we shouldn't or not have it. I'm talking more culturally around like what it means at that level, right? If you're thinking about media evolutions, you could start thinking about, oh, okay, this could be respected, right? That's kind of a wild one to be thinking about. And going in these evolutions, what we're trying to say is that games are growing up, right? Great quote. Gosh, it's 10 years old now. That newer games peer into the dark reaches of the very real human heart to deliver stories that are thrilling, chilling, and absorbing, right? That was a quote from a games journalist in 2010 talking about like the next crop of games that were becoming much more serious. Does anybody recognize the avatars on the screen? They're all from the same game.
Doom, probably. No, Wolfenstein, I'm sorry.
Wolfenstein, yeah. I forget the character's name right now, but this is all the same character.
BJ Blazkowicz.
Yeah, that's right. BJ Blazkowicz. Why would we shift towards this image?
It most represents us.
Yeah, definitely. What would be the benefit of making the avatar look more real, besides that graphics can do that now?
It's shiny.
Oh, that's what I'm getting at. Like, besides that, like, it's shiny. Like, what would be some benefits to that?
When a person looks like a person, you can sympathize with them more than when they look like a pixel.
Yeah, Riley said more relatable. Of course, right? And even the Wolfenstein 3D games, if folks are playing those, have become much more narratively driven. They're a little more complex than shooting Nazis. Much to the chagrin of some fans of the franchise, when it was just like, hey, Hitler's got a robot body, shoot him in his head and balls, right? And now there's like actually a pretty deep narrative behind the Wolfenstein games. I don't know if anybody played this version of it. This goes back early 80s. This is the one that I grew up on, 91, 93, something along those lines, where it was just like, those guys are Nazis and you shoot them. That's your job, right? We've talked a little bit about this in class already, this shift towards developers focusing more on above-the-neck verbs than below-the-neck verbs. What does that mean? What would be an example of a below-the-neck verb?
Below-the-neck verb?
Yeah.
Punching.
Okay.
Kicking.
Punching, kicking. What do these verbs all have in common?
Physical action.
They're action oriented. They're more about doing things, running, shooting, moving around. They're more action oriented. They're more enjoyment oriented. They're probably more similar to sort of where video games came from, right? So then what are above the neck verbs?
Facial expression.
Emotions.
Probably emotions are happening in your mind. All right, give me some examples of them, though.
I've been playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey.
Sorry. Not examples of games, but examples of verbs.
Oh, sorry.
Like, what would be some good examples of above-the-neck verbs? Think on it for just a couple minutes. I'll be right back, okay?
I have never heard the term below the neck verbs.
This is new for me. The more you learn. Hmm. Oh, I'm seeing stuff. Oh man, that seems to be like stuff like I believe, I know, I understand, I hope, that kind of deal. Guess it has to do with the brain.
Sorry, had to let the dog out, and she wouldn't come back upstairs. So what do we got? Above the neck verbs.
I mean, I'm looking at stuff and it's mostly relating to stuff like knowledge, like believe, know, understand, hope, that kind of deal.
Yep, so thinking, feeling, contemplating.
Smell, taste, hear.
Well, those are senses, right? Although you could play a role in here. The point we're trying to make is that a lot of newer development is focusing on what happens in here, which was not traditionally the focus of video games, right? Like, this game was not developed to elicit deep elaboration, right? What's the storyline here? There isn't one.
The enemies. That's
yeah. Who are the people involved? What are their backstories? Why are they in space? Why is the needle fighting the wedge? None of that's present here. It's just a
not really important.
Say again?
It's not really important in the context of the game.
It's irrelevant, right? We had the conversation last week about chess. Or when I say week, I mean, of course, the last time we met, right? And what was the point I was making when we were talking about chess? We don't know their stories, their motivations, their narrative structure, their, deep moral parables. That's not how it's designed. Now, this is a game that's designed to make you think, of course, right? But there's no deeper elaboration into the motivations, backstories, or decision-making involved in this game. And every decision you make, for the most part, is purely strategic. To the point where it's completely acceptable to sacrifice lives to win. That's how the game works. That's how it's played, right? It's an important part of the game. So when we're coming down here, what we're talking about is the shift from like here, these are below the neck verbs, right? Like characters punching, kicking, fighting, screaming. I guess screaming happens above your neck, but you get my point, right? This is decidedly below the neck. Enjoyment, action, arousal, fun. All of these things connect in that way. Does that kind of follow? Does that make sense? This would be your standard development, right? And then, of course, we have the shift to... Well, let's look at this image real quick. What is happening in these two images?
They're doing motion capture.
That
they can put the facial models and the physical movements into the game.
Right.
So that they look as realistic as possible.
So when we see this model here, right? Why doesn't he have any mocap on his face?
Because his face is going... Well, his face isn't relevant. It's going to be somebody else's.
That part. Well, but of course you might still want the muscle framing, right? The facial gestures, because you can take a skeleton, you can take a wire map and put it on somebody else's face. But Alex, beyond that, why isn't his face irrelevant here? Or sorry, why is his face irrelevant here? What are they mapping?
Because he's not the face that they're going to be using for the character. It's going to be somebody completely different.
I think there's a more important reason, though. What's being mapped here, folks?
Baseball, swing movement.
Physical movements.
Physical movements, right? You're not wrong, Alex. You're probably going to use someone else's face. But I think more critically, they don't care. They want to make sure the bat swung the right way. Because this game is going to focus wholly on below the neck verbs. Hit the ball, right? Hit the ball as hard as you can. We don't really care what your physical facial gestures are. They have no bearing on this game in any way, shape, or form. In fact, many of you who do play sports games would have noticed that, like in the 2000s, you saw this really big uptick in the moves your players could make. But there are a lot of critiques about sports games kind of falling into the uncanny valley, where what ended up happening for a lot of these games is that, like, the player models, like, physically, like, moved awesome. But they had, like, zombie-looking faces, or, like, their eyes didn't move, or their skin was, like, super shiny all the time. And it was, like, from a distance, they looked super cool, but they didn't have, like, any... I see Phil nodding his head a little bit. Or is that your laptop? I can't tell.
Mm-hmm. It's both.
Okay. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, I think FIFA was a big one. Like, the player models were beautiful, but they looked freaking weird.
I mean, it's still the case. They're getting better at it, but it's still like the player models are much better. And if you look at the PES series, which is a different soccer video game, for a while they were a lot more focused on graphics, and that's why people bought them a lot, because they look kind of like when 2K and NBA Live were still competing. 2K was much better at graphics, and that's kind of where it got it started, and then it also got better at gameplay. But PES and FIFA have different gameplay. A lot of people prefer the PES series because it's supposed to look more realistic at close range.
And of course here, we're not talking about just that it's clear, it's that for most sports games, the player's facial expression means nothing for the gameplay. They could all wear bags over their heads, right? And it wouldn't matter in terms of, like, playing FIFA or playing hockey, right? But you are now seeing a development towards, you know, making the whole package look realistic. And in fact, if anybody plays the NBA games, there's an entire narrative mode to where suddenly facial expressions do matter, because you're actually trying to communicate some kind of above the neck, you know, feeling. I remember some earlier sports games where you'd, like, score a goal and they would zoom in on the action, and like the player's face, it was like kind of hollow looking because they didn't really map that part very well because it wasn't relevant to the gameplay. Conversely, why is this person's face being mapped so much?
Because they need to map the accurate facial expressions, and so there are a lot of micro movements that a face makes that translates to a full facial expression.
And in a game that is maybe more focused on appreciation, that might be really important. Like, if you want to show Walker's face being disrupted by, you know, looking confused. I mean, like, I think Javier called it, like, he looks blown away. Like, I don't know what to think right now. There's a lot that went into that player mod. That is a lot of processing power. It's a lot of graphical fidelity. There's a lot of engineering that goes into this. Or if you go back to the Pixel example, the Pixar examples, the amount of money that goes into making hair look good, right? You don't do that unless it's going to matter for the gameplay. You know, and here we're not talking about realism so much as we're talking about this above the neck, below the neck divide, right? And the point we're making is when you start talking about above the neck content, all of a sudden above the neck content matters for your other parts of your development. Let me bring up something real quick. Does anybody know why Mario looks this way?
To be a plumber.
Yeah. I mean, that was the inspiration. But, like, why a hat?
To make it more distinct and more clear that, you know, it's supposed to be a fairly detailed person on the limited pixels.
Well, why didn't they just give him hair? I mean, people have hair.
Because hair looks weird compared to a hat at times.
Believe it or not, it wasn't about image. I mean, that may have played a role, but there was another reason why they did this. And it's the same reason why, by the way, one second. Yeah, there we go. Why does Bugs Bunny have gloves on? Oh, it went away.
Bugs Bunny wears gloves.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a whole Looney Tunes episode, like the new show, where he loses his gloves and it affects him mentally.
Yeah. Why does he wear gloves? Mickey Mouse wears gloves. Bugs Bunny wears gloves. Like many of these animated characters wear gloves.
I guess it's because his feet are white, so they needed to make his hands white and make a way for it to make sense.
So believe it or not, those are all good guesses. Phil and Jared hit it. It's much more functional than that. It's hard to animate hands. It's just really hard to animate hands and paws. For video games, hair is impossible to animate, and it takes up too much memory. But a static hat, that doesn't, it's just a bunch of red pixels. It takes less memory. What's interesting about all of this is that, and I don't know how much you've read blogs where they talk about like famous cheats in video games that developers use to save memory. Like one of them is in they talk about I should read the blogs and get back to you on that. But there's lots of examples in video games where they'll use tricks in the game to save memory to process the game world for you. So one of the biggest ones, if anybody's ever played a PC game, is draw distance, right? The game doesn't render the entire world. It only renders what you need to see, because otherwise it would crash, right? If you go in a room, the game basically dumps everything else and you only see what's in the room because you don't need to have everything else rendered, right?
I remember watching I don't remember what it's called. A guy was making an original game that would run on the NES hardware and was going over all the individual steps and all the tricks. I think the game he made is called Micro Mages or something. He's making a multiplayer game that ran at kind of like modern standards in some ways. And it was, he went over all the little tricks he did to make it work with limited memory.
There's a famous...
I thought it was really cool to have a look into that.
I can't recall the streamer's name, but there's a famous streamer who has taken video games and retconned them to run on any other console. And one of his famous ones is he took I think it's The Witcher and was able to run it off a USB drive. And he was doing something, and maybe the same person, and showing all the different ways that you reconfigure and trick a game to get it to work on a different console. And it's kind of a cool area.
And there's the porting Doom to calculators and
yep, I've seen those before. Yep, there's a version of Super Mario Brothers you can play in Microsoft Excel. With the right hardware, and of course these are all good examples of none of this stuff mattered if you're trying to focus on the enjoyment and gameplay aspects. And of course, what we're seeing now is they're coming together. Like Phil was mentioning, now you do have sports games where they are trying to get both sets of the equation, and a lot of games are trying to do that. My understanding is it can take as much processing power to do this as it can to do this. And so you're going to see some of these clashes. And, I pick on Javier here because I know his film background. Some of these limitations are going to be technical. Like, how do we actually develop the technologies and learn the production side of things to make these things happen, right? And if you want to have fun sometime, there are several blogs online where they show famous game hacks. And one of the ones that I'm most familiar with, I'm just forgetting what game it's in, which is why the example isn't going to really make any sense, is where they'll create NPCs to be things like elevators or item boxes. And they'll tether them to an NPC ghost because it's easier to program a ghost walking than it is to program a box. And there's all sorts of these weird hacks you see. Well, the reason all this is important, these parts here, is that they point to something happening in games. Dylan mentioned, does it run on Crysis? Dylan, in fact, my old PC, I bought it because it came with Crysis. And that was their big marketing thing. Nice. It was this PC, and it could run it in ultra setting. And that was its marketing. It was this game. And in fact, it comes with Crysis. They're here you go. You can play it, have fun. And I still have Crysis. It was a pretty good game.
Crysis in VR.
I haven't played that one yet.
One thing kind of interesting, kind of on the topic of Oh, can it run zone? So the new Microsoft Flight Simulator is so ridiculous to run. And it takes real-time information from like traffic and everything too. It's ridiculous.
Yep. Well, you know, and on that point, in thinking about this discussion of the two different types of entertainment, how many of you have read about a controversy in esports where players will play games and turn off all the graphics or turn them down super low?
Yeah, so you can like see people better.
Yeah, well, some of it's strategic. Like you can see different characters better. It's easier to like spot an enemy from another one.
Frame rate.
Frame rate's another one. Like it literally runs the game faster, right? But those are great examples of they could give a damn about realism because they're competing, right? I just want to win. I don't care if it looks like France or not. I just want to shoot things. And if I can dial down my frame rate and make things run, or dial down my graphics, make the game run faster and get into it. But it's a great example of where like this, they don't care about that. Totally irrelevant. Right? But like if you played Heavy Rain and you turned off all the textures and all of the character mods, like it would be a weird game because part of that game is connecting with the characters. It's the above the neck verbs that make that game work. It's the fact that, Alex, if I remember, doesn't your child die like 10 minutes into the game? Yeah, like
Jason gets hit by a car in the first like 10 minutes of the game, and so you watch it happen.
Yeah, and it's right. You just got finished like playing with him, like you're throwing him up in the air with your arms, and then you are like at the mall with him, and then he gets knocked by a car or a bus, and you're like, "What just happened?" Like, my son is dead. Games aren't supposed to kill my kids.
Well, yeah, a stupid kid just walks into the middle of the street and dances in the street, and a car hits him.
And a car hits him. Talk about ambushing you. Like, what just happened? Like, what? You know, like that is going to be here. You're not turning the frame rate down on that one, right? So we can see these pleasures of cognition and these pleasures of control. Maybe these digital drama and comedy masks. And I might even say pleasure isn't the right word because it's not always fun. It usually is fun in the long term looking back, but it's not always fun when it's happening because the experience is supposed to be a bit more detailed and complicated. And we know that gamers report a wide variety of emotions. I think I've covered some of these in class, but to go through them to make sure we're on the same page. Guilt reactions. That one we've already talked about. Lindsay and Phil talked about it last time. You know, we do things in a game, and sometimes we do them, and then we feel weird about it. And we actually think, like, maybe I did the wrong thing. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. I was playing an old game for the Sega Master System recently called Miracle Warriors that I was playing last night, and many folks think this was the first JRPG to be ported to the United States. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's been the claim. And I was playing last night, and the game has a, you know, you can earn money and you can earn fangs for valor and victory. It also tracked your reputation. You know, if you do good things in the game, you get good reputation. If you do bad things in the game, you get bad reputation. So some of the bad things you can do when you're walking around the environment, you encounter monsters, of course. That's like every RPG ever. You know, the whole storyline is a woman broke the dark seal and now there's monsters everywhere. You've probably heard that storyline before. And your job is to put the seal back on. But when you're in the world, there are merchants and travelers and just normal people. And of course, when you encounter them, if you attack them, your credibility goes down. But if you talk to them, your credibility goes up, and they give you tips about the game world. But of course, if you attack them, what's the benefit? You get money. You know, if you see a merchant and you kill him, he might be carrying a couple $1,000s, right? So choice is yours. And so for the most part, I play good. I always talk to everybody. I don't kill them. There's even mages in the world that if you talk to them, they'll attack you, but they'll also disappear. But if you kill a mage, you take up a credibility hit. And you've played these games before where if your credibility is too low, you can't do certain things. Or you try to go into a village and they won't even let you in because your credibility is too low. And you have to go out and repair your reputation.
If you like games like that, a VR game I recommend is Saints and Sinners, where you have lots of choices and you can... And I think it affects the outcome of the ending.
Yeah, put it in the chat if you don't mind, the link. Well, in this game, there are these mythical creatures that are in caves. And they're always guarding, like, the most important weapons in the game, the most important armor in the game. Well, if you want mythical armor, you have to kill these creatures. If you kill the creatures, your reputation takes a huge hit because the creatures always live in caves near cities. And the people in those cities respect and revere the creatures like gods. And this sounds all stupid. It's just a video game. But last night, I spent a half hour trying to figure out if there's any way that I could get this certain armor without killing this two-headed fox. It turns out, I have a real big thing against walkthroughs. I will not read them until I beat a game. Because I don't want any cheating. I want to figure it out on my own. And I beat this game when I was like 11, but I haven't played it since then. And so finally I broke down, I killed the fox. And I went back online to read, like, is there any way you can't? And I felt good because they said, no, in the video game, you don't have a choice. You have to kill the fox. And the way it works is if you kill the fox, you have to make sure your reputation's high enough that you can suffer a reputation hit. Why am I saying all of this? I felt guilty, believe it or not. When I killed this fox, and then I got my armor, and then I saw my reputation go down, and it was like oh, no way. Like, no, that's not me. Like, I'm the hero. I can't take a reputation hit. Like, come on, what do I do? So I responded by being like a bloodthirsty murderer for the next 20 minutes, like killing everything around me. But, you know, you kill enough monsters, it goes back up. Guilt is a big part of gaming. We see that. Moral deliberations are a big part of gaming. Again, above the neck verbs, right? We're talking about aspects of games that aren't below the neck, that are happening kind of up here. Making moral decisions, and that's become an increasingly popular gaming device. It's become an increasingly popular part of all sorts of games. Has anybody, even in sports games, when you have like a career mode, sometimes you have to make moral decisions. Anybody here play MLB The Show? I'm just curious. It's a baseball game. There's a part of the game where you have a career and you start off in the minor leagues. Actually, you start off in high school. You play in an all-star game, and based on how well you play in that game, you get certain stat bonuses, and then you get drafted by a major league team, and then they send you to the minor leagues. As you play in the minor leagues, you know, if you play well, you get better stats, and at some point, you play well enough to where you get a call from an agent. Up to that point in the video game, your agent is your high school coach. And then you have to make the decision, do I dump my coach and go with an agent, or do I stay with my coach? And what's the moral dilemma they're having you play with there? What's the, like, what are they having you do? Like, why have this? What are they going for?
It's like the moral dilemma, like choosing a person or a career. Which one do you value more?
Like your coach has been following your career all your life, and then suddenly you got to be a pro. But guess what? That's how professional sports work. Like at some point, if you're good enough, you can't get better unless you have like a legitimate agent. But it's wild to like put that decision in a video game about baseball. And then once you do that, you have to pick different agents, and different agents have different strengths. So some of them are really good at getting you endorsements, but they're also really shady and they have a bad reputation. And some of them are super driven with reputation, but they're not very good. And so you won't make as much money. And as you play the video game, it actually tracks your career earnings. So you can find out like how much money you made, you know, during your 20-year career or whatever. Phil's talking about FIFA doing the same thing. And then, yeah, there's times where you like for my game, I asked my agent for a trade. He couldn't get it for me. And then the game says, like, do you want to fire your agent? Or do you want to give him a second chance? And it plays with all of these, like, above-the-neck verbs in a video game that you wouldn't expect. And the decisions become surprisingly moral. If you care, right? I mean, if you're playing for different reasons and you don't care, then you make different decisions. And so it's not so much that the games have to be moral. It's that you have the option to make them moral or not. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of these new developments. And then, yeah, we're seeing these in other types of video games, right? all experiences we already talked about. Nostalgia, I think we've talked about a little bit. And there's lots of others. And the point here is that we're seeing research where when you interview players about these experiences, going back to, again, to Jared's kind of anchor question, yeah, I mean, almost everybody you interview will say, I've had a fun time playing video games. That's not surprising. What you will see is about 3/4 of the sample can also talk about having eudaimonic experiences. And I think that data really surprised people. That 3 out of every 4 gamers you would talk to would be able to recall a meaningful, introspective, self-reflective, like many of you on the call had in your questions and stories today. Oh yeah, I remember playing a video game and having like that feels moment where it wasn't about challenge. It was about the narrative, the characters, my decisions. It was about above the neck verbs. And I think that data surprised a lot of people. And so it got a decent amount of attention. Here's that model I was talking about earlier. So when people are talking about meaningful games, they're often talking about storyline. Okay. You notice how there's really no relationship between meaningful game and gameplay ratings. Because that's not what makes... Gameplay doesn't make a game meaningful. Narrative does make a game meaningful. And I think based on everything we've talked about today, that kind of makes sense. Again, it doesn't mean this isn't good, but it's explaining something different. And when folks do have these meaningful experiences, these gameplay experiences, they focus a lot more on relatedness, being connected to other people in the game. There's even some focus on autonomy, which is like making your own choices. Kind of makes sense. If the narrative's realistic and good, well, I have more choices I can make inside that narrative. And of course, what you're seeing here is that, you know, the gameplay is meaningful. It drives my ratings of the story. I feel closer to the people in the content. I also feel as though I'm getting a little more insight and like appreciation out of insight out of the experiences. And these things all impact appreciation. I mean, it's okay if you don't understand the math behind this model. The general idea is that we see this path down below.
I can kind of insert one of my questions in here. If you
Sure.
want to. So I wrote that, you know, what's the word eudaimonic?
It's pronounced several different ways. Eudaimonic works just fine.
Yeah. Eudaimonic experiences with games, you know, seem to be mostly tied with story.
Yeah.
You know, the story within the game.
And that's what we're seeing here.
Yeah. And my question was basically, can a game still have eudaimonic qualities even if it doesn't have a story to begin with?
We don't know. Not based on current data, but that data also assumes story mattered, right? You'd probably have to. I don't know, right? The question would have to be, but of course, one argument could be, well, that's a tough one.
I could give an example that I think maybe fits.
Okay.
There's a game called, I played some of it, not fully through, but there's a game called Antichamber, and it's puzzle based. And a lot of the puzzles are based about the themes of just kind of like life, like picking yourself back up or, you know, valuing those around you, that kind of deal. It's not really a story. There's no characters, there's no plot really, but the puzzles are kind of based off of like a moral themes in a way.
So there's the rub, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're writing the story. You're interpreting it as you play it, right? So one of the things about gaming that actually, Javi, I think it's a good study to do. My gut reaction would be that this is an example of co-authorship where the player is writing the story in their mind, right?
Okay.
As they play this game, they realize pretty quickly it's not just about the puzzle. It's about the experience. In fact, I don't know. Actually, that's a really great question. I could see a study on this, frankly, because as a puzzle game, we would automatically assume competency, autonomy, enjoyment, right?
All right.
Puzzle game, gameplay, competency, autonomy, enjoyment. And that would be the assumption. But I suspect what's going on is that players in that game are also able to interpret like this personal deeper meaning, the insight need, right? We should talk about that. I could see an argument for why that game could be void of, and I think what I hear you saying is like an objective narrative. The game gives you no narrative. Right. It just says play. But it's designed in a way that makes you think about yourself.
Your personal experiences.
Yeah. That would be really wild to think about, actually. I'd have to chew on that. Because if that were true, what it would suggest is it's less about, while of course narrative is important to appreciation, narrative doesn't always mean what's on screen. And we do know from this class, for example, that video games are often thought of in terms of co-authorship, right? Where what's happening is the person playing it is writing a story while they play the game. That's a good question. This is on Steam?
Yeah.
I'm gonna buy this for the lab and play around with that idea.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'll do that because that's what it's reminding me of. And I was trying to find this image for folks here. So I have a TurboGrafx 16 system. And there was this, I can't find any good images of the game. There's this, here's one. You can watch the video on your
football season is here.
There's an old, back in the 90s, a real popular style of game where these side-scrolling shooters. And there's one called Psychosis. I'll see if we can play a little bit of it right now. And the game was meant to be a side-scrolling shooter, but it took place in your subconscious. And it's a little bizarre. Like, it's out there, you know? I'm not sure inherently how well this is your subconscious, per se. But you see how there's occasional rips in the fabric?
Oh, yeah.
And you'll see whenever a power-up pops up, it kind of pulls in from the side. And this was kind of meant to simulate the deep mind. It was a pretty trippy game. And as you go through it, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. Yeah, I don't know how well this worked. I know when I played it, it's definitely trippy. There's no question about that. Yeah, it's on the TurboGrafx 16 Collector's Edition. And then, again, I don't know if it ever actually came out in the United States. But it was meant to simulate the subconsciousness. Again, I don't know how well of a job it did with that. But it was definitely trippy, I can tell you that much. You see things like oozing over and dripping and... You know, and I'll turn the sound on. This is a long play video. It's about 30 minutes long. So, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I never thought about that. So I'll mark this for future study. And then maybe get back to you, because that could be...
Yeah, because, like, when I think, like, in terms of, like, film, like, there's things that I would argue that I say I could appreciate about a film that's not directly tied to the story. Like I could appreciate, the way this shot is lit.
Well, so remember, though, this is a common thing in research. I think you're talking a bit about aesthetics now. And that's not wrong, of course. But it's a different type of thing, right? And this is where language gets tough, right? Because we're using appreciation here to mean something very specific. And in this particular research, the target of appreciation is not the game. It's the self. It's that game made me think about myself. Which is different from, oh, hey, look at how well programmed this is. Which is something else we should be talking about. But we don't see much research at all into aesthetics.
Okay.
research and
So
aesthetics.
appreciation more in regards to self rather than like qualities.
This is exactly. This is now. It could be the case that certain qualities drive this score, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Phil and Jerry talking about the game Amnesia. We're seeing more of these type of games, but of course, again, those do have stories. I think what Javi is pointing out is like Psychosis, and then Antichamber. Antichamber is just a puzzle game. That's it. Like, it's just you move boxes around. But I think what he's arguing is that you do it in a way that kind of cues these. Oh, I get it. This is a metaphor for my deep subconsciousness, or oh, I get this is a metaphor for this, and that does become interesting. So, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question for later work. I'm gonna bookmark it, and Lindsay will probably put this on the lab computers. I think that's a good idea. Thank you for that.
Oh.
All right, so we've kind of already talked about co-authorship in this class several times, but you look at something like this, and there's more to this game than just the world. There's how you're authoring and experiencing the world, and I think Breath of the Wild is an interesting example of a game that has a lot of both above the neck and below the neck verbs. So to answer the question, can you have both? Definitely. What makes the action RPG particularly good at this is it does tend to do both, right? The action RPG requires you to play the game like a platformer, right? But also has several of these touchstone moments that remind you that it's more than just a platformer, right? We've already talked about eudaimonia quite a bit, but it often has to do with sort of like this notion of self-fulfillment. And so if you've seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, oftentimes what we're talking about here is this idea of being kind of deeply connected with the self, right? It comes from a Greek word about, the good spirit or happiness. Some folks refer to eudaimonia in terms of flourishing, right? And so people need a sense of eudaimonia to really be who they are. It definitely comes from the positive psychology school of thought, right? And again, what we're kind of arguing today is that games as a platform can encourage these things. And by extension, VR as a platform. We're talking about interactive platforms where normally we think about them as being simulations of below-the-neck action can inspire these deeper feelings. I mean, I'm thinking of VR. Most our conversations in VR are about natural mapping. How good is it at letting me move? How good is it at letting me touch things, right? And maybe what's missing in those conversations is this above the neck thing, right? If I can put you in a digital world that's not your own, is there the potential for you to connect and care more about that digital world? And that conversation often gets kind of put to the wayside. And going back up here, we're kind of more focused on this part of things than this part of things, There's even been sort of a pushback against the notion of interactive storytelling. And the idea has been it's not a thing. Like, it doesn't make it any better because it's interactive. That we may have to learn a very different way of telling stories in VR for them to actually work. Not that we can't, but, if we were to plot in here, and maybe my VR folks in the call can help with this, I don't know where we're at in this narrative, in this evolutionary progression.
Well, we're past demonstration.
We're definitely past demonstration. I think you're right about that. I think we've mostly gotten out of the idea of, ooh, look, you have a headset on, and now you can see things in 3D. Like, I think we're past that, right?
I'd probably say we're somewhere between replication and extension.
That's my gut, too. And of course, that makes sense with the evolution of the medium. Like, maybe we haven't had that true killer app that goes, okay, here's what's different. What do you think the best candidates would be for like that true killer app that finally shows us that, okay, this experience is different than anything before?
For VR, it was probably Half-Life Alyx, I have to say.
You think so?
Kind of that.
How so?
In my experience, the day I booted up Half-Life Alyx, I played it for 6 hours straight on a hardwood floor without shoes on, and I didn't even notice until after the fact. So that kind of level of just pure immersion into the game and the experience is something that you can't really ignore. And from what I've heard, a lot of other people that played the game have also gone through like a long period of time, like Jared and Avery here could probably attest to that kind of experience.
But what made it different from any other video game except for you were
so polished, so well made?
Well, what I'm getting at though is I don't disagree with you. I think it's a great experience. But one of the critiques, of course, right, is that it's still a video game. Like, it's super, super good. Like, wow, I'm there. But it's still kind of replicating like everything else I've ever done. It's just doing it in a way that's really, really good, right? Like, putting cameras in theaters to film vaudeville shows was better than going to the show, right? Because you could actually watch it at home, but it was still the same conventions, right? That's an interesting one, because I think maybe what that one did is it showed people, and the idea, by the way, behind this evolution, if you can't replicate what's popular first, nobody will believe you that it can do more. So the idea is like, first I have to fit in. I have to be able to show that my technology can do everything the current technology can do, and it can do it like even better. And the idea behind that is that's how you get like your initial acceptance. And then once you get your initial acceptance, the next stage is, okay, not only can I replicate everything that's out there in a really good polished way, but I can also do something more that the previous experiences could not do. So that's an interesting case. That's an interesting case. I think if I were writing an article on this and I was critiquing it, I would probably say that it's a really good example of a replication, like a really, really good one. Maybe even to the point where it shows like, okay, gamers, you can take VR seriously now because it can do this in a way. Because Alex, like you mentioned, one of the big knocks on VR, right, is no one's going to play for a long time. And you're like, nope, that wasn't a problem. I had no problem playing this game for a long time. That was fantastic. That was amazing.
Something interesting on that note is sometimes you forget you're exhausted until you come out.
Yeah, sure. That's the flow state, right? You're like, wow, okay. I'm actually kind of sore.
That's also something that a lot of athletes go through, like professional athletes. You can interview them, and through interviews, they've said like they don't even realize that they're tired until either after the game is over,
right,
or like at the very end when they're leaving that flow state.
Yeah, part of the flow state is marked by a loss of awareness and a loss of focus on everything else, right? So yeah, you get somebody out of the game and suddenly they're like, oh my gosh, I can't move. Like, I'm so exhausted. I'm just gonna sit in this chair. And
I'm sure Dylan's got some of that because Dylan's actually pretty good at Beat Saber, and he goes through some really fast songs.
Yep, I can see that where it's like after you play, you're like, okay, I need an ice bath, right? So my question then is, what would have to be the extension? Like, what would be the thing that we think would show folks that VR is doing it differently? Because that's probably the linchpin right now.
I think we're going to have a really solid MMO, honestly. Kind of like all the movies, like Ready Player One kind of built up the hype for that. I think we're going to have a really good thing kind of like that for it to really break that, that linchpin.
Some folks have mentioned it might be social VR, might be the big killer app when you can, because so much of the development was always about you alone. Right? You put on the suit, you put on the headset, but you block out the world. But of course, what's wild about that, going back to Alex's point, is in some ways, it's not new. Like, we already have social MMOs, right? So the VR version just lets you be there in every sense of the way, but it's also still Warcraft. It's just Warcraft, but I have a headset on.
And there are different ways to do things. I don't know if you keep up with every VR thing at all times like I do. But there's a MMO coming out, I believe, next year. At least their alpha's coming out, called Zenith, and it's looking to shape up to be what VR might need. It's an MMO, but it not only plays with it uses, you know, your hands to do the attacks and different things to use the different abilities, and it'll be, yeah.
So the extension there might go back to our earlier classes on progressive embodiment. That one thing video games can't do is they cannot have progressive embodiment. Like, they are limited, right? Maybe that's the distinction where, you know, games have been able to start telling interactive stories, but at some point there might be something they can't do. And I'm thinking about what Alex said, and I'm thinking about what you're saying, Jared, and maybe what it is the extension, in this case, is like the literal extension of the self, right? Where we're no longer constrained by an abstract mapping system that doesn't quite work for the actions on screen. That maybe what's starting to happen is we're, you know, going back to presence, right? Maybe that, when what's odd about that, of course, is presence is not new. We talk about presence in video games all the time. Maybe what we're saying is there's a limit. Like in a console or PC game, there's only so far you can go. You cannot progressively embody the self. But in these systems, you can. And that might be the extension when you go, okay, now that the body has been, you know, now that I have been progressively embodied in the medium, so the other side of the question is, how do you have to design it differently as a result? You know, this is the big thing filmmakers are facing right now. How do you shoot a scene in 3D? Because it breaks every convention of filmmaking. Like, all of a sudden, these, like, and I'm sure Javi can give us a masterclass on this, like, some of the basic notions of shot framing out the window. Like, they don't work anymore. And that's the part I'm curious about. So I think you're both on something about progressive embodiment. Where I want to know is, where does that meet with some other change to where this extension is not just an MMO with a headset, but it's something fundamentally different?
I would say they become more of a personal experience.
That's been talked about too. Yeah, the idea that, you know, yeah, I don't know. It's going to be curious. And of course, maybe we don't have an answer because we literally, like, this has been the big development, right? I know there's a lot of commentators that have suggested that the killer app for VR will probably not be a video game.
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, maybe what might be give it, like, this extension, like, I don't know, like, in regards to, like, eudaimonic experiences, like, maybe, you know, a great story told within the VR headset. I don't know. Like,
well, and of course, that's the rub, right, is we don't know how to do it yet. And it's kind of like going back to this film example. Imagine what films were like when we didn't have cuts.
Right.
Right. Anybody here has probably shot footage on their smartphone.
Yeah.
Good luck telling an entire narrative in one take. Some people do it. It takes like months of planning, right, to do the famous single cut films, and there aren't many of them. It's one thing to film 1 minute of your dog eating a pizza on the floor. It's another thing to tell that into a larger story. So these are great questions, and I would challenge everybody to be thinking about these. Like, what is it about Zenith that might be the extension? What was it about Half-Life Alyx that may have been the extension versus the replication? You're probably right. We're probably somewhere in this middle ground as those different developers now try to find that next big piece. In film, it was the Odessa Steps method. Some guy in Europe figured out how to cut. I mean, I know it sounds silly, but he thought, oh, wait a minute. I could cut this, glue this here, and then cut it back again. And now I have a baby carriage going down the stairs and a woman screaming. And then a baby carriage going down the stairs and a woman screaming. And suddenly the audience felt this tension they'd never felt before. Right?
I could, real quick, I could maybe apply this to like a technology outside of video.
Sure.
I'm thinking in terms of drones and how they have evolved, because I pretty much have seen them, like, when they started to what they do now. Because when they started, they were more like a fun thing to fly, like radio control kind of deal. And now, and then people were like, well, why don't we put like a camera on this to get like a, you know, a POV? And now it's like, it's a market now. You buy drones as like a film tool, not like a fun, you know, flying tool. You use it as an actual like camera equipment. Or some people have extended that to using the camera for like FPV drone racing, and now have made it a sport, and or use drones for like actual construction stuff that actually happens now.
Yeah, it had to start with, hey, this thing can fly. And then from there, okay, it can fly like everything else flies. And then it was, oh, wow, you know what? I can use this drone to deliver packages. I can't. Could a helicopter do that? Yeah. Would it be super disruptive? You bet. Right? That's exactly right. And so that's why this model is really, really clever. And I mean, I've written about it, but I would encourage you, frankly, to read Stober's version of it. It's a little more detailed. So it's an interesting question to think about moving forward, right? To kind of give some different eudaimonic experiences, there's the idea of appreciation being important to eudaimonia. You know, you have to have the introspective, self-reflective experience in order to have that human flourishing, right? We can often see eudaimonia split up into different gaming experiences. And so one is the meaningful experience where I attach personal meaning to something. So like, anybody recognize this game?
No.
It's an old game called Contra. It's for the Nintendo. It was for NES back in the 80s.
I was trying to remember it. I was like, oh, isn't that Contra?
Yeah, just Contra. It's a side scroller, not really made to be even remotely interesting or exciting. I mean, it's a platformer. It's below the neck enjoyment. The narrative's never really quite clear at any point in the game. You shoot the stuff that comes at you until you're done with the last level. This one was meaningful to me because it was my very first date with Jamie. We decided to play some video games, and for whatever reason, we picked up Contra, and we beat it. And like that was this weird moment. It was like, whoa, like this was like teamwork. We played together. We're gonna get along really well. And of course, now we've been together for 5+ years, right? So it doesn't have to be a game. Going back to something said earlier, that necessarily has deep narrative to be important. If you're telling your own narrative in the experience, right? We could talk about emotionally moving experiences that are specific to a game event. I don't know if anybody knows who Psycho Mantis is from Metal Gear Solid.
Psycho Mantis?
Yeah. But this was the time when the character takes over your controller and starts reading your memory card. And you're like, what is...
You like to play Konami games.
Yeah, you play Castlevania, and yeah, he would read your mind. And of course, if you remember the character, I'm guessing Alex does, Psycho Mantis was a psychic. So it was pretty wild that while you're playing this video game, this character reads your mind, your memory card, customized to you, takes over your controller, and of course, the spoiler alert, to beat him, you have to plug your controller into the second port.
Yep.
Because he can't read that controller, and then you can beat him. But if you try to play it in the first-person port, he's nearly impossible because he literally takes over your mind. That was pretty wild. It was like, okay, I don't quite follow this. Another way of thinking about this, so that was unexpected. These are also like those difficult in-game decisions you have to make, that kind of stuff, right? There's the self-reflective experience where you're playing a video game that gives you a lot of freedom and you learn a lot about yourself while you play the game. Lots of folks on the... Oh, yeah, Matt asked about the code. With the code, Matt, I definitely used 30 lives on that one. This was not a 5-live victory. I have beat it without the code, though, so I'm proud to say that I've done that. But, of course, that's partly because if you play Contra enough times over 30 years in your life, you memorize every single last enemy, right? Some of you on the...
Salt relatively recently did a Contra speedrunning video.
Yeah. And that's a game that went from very hard to very easy once you learn the patterns. A lot of you have heard me talk about my experiences playing Red Dead Redemption 2. And the funny thing is, I hardly ever leave the start world. I spend a lot of time riding my horse, taking photos, catching animals, and saving people who get attacked in the game. If you play Red Dead Redemption, throughout the background, people just like get robbed or get like shot at or get attacked. And for some reason in this game, I spend hours just chasing people around. and hunting legendary animals. The storyline, I don't know. Like, I only advance the story if I absolutely have to get to a new region, and otherwise I just don't care that much. And it's an interesting self-reflection. Like, it's like I'm playing cowboy and hero. I also like Western movies, and I like a lot of this stuff. So maybe it's not overly surprising that I would do it in a video game.
Yeah, I started playing that 2 weeks ago.
It's a good game. Don't get me wrong, but like I have never finished it out. I haven't left like the first zone yet, really.
Oh, it's extremely long. It's extremely long.
Maybe over break, right? This one here, another type of eudaimonia, is connected to sociality. So this one here, this is basically my childhood in a nutshell. Every arcade in St. Louis had this machine. What do you notice about it immediately? It's a bit unique.
A lot bigger and
wide.
Big, wide, 6 players at one time. And that was like, shut the front door. What do you mean 6 people can play at once? And, oh, brother, man, and actually this game's on PS4, and you can play 6 people at a time. And if you log in even today, you can still easily find 5 teammates within a minute. Like, it was just this very, it was just a beat 'em up, but you could play all 6 X-Men. And it was crazy. So, all right. Connecting to other characters. Pokemon Yellow. What made Pokemon Yellow unique?
Pikachu. You always get a Pikachu and it follows you around.
Yeah, that was important for me. It was weirdly important for me to get Pokemon Yellow. Because that's my version of Pikachu. He's out there with me. Right? Like, it was always weird, actually, to play the other Pokemon and he's not with you. Like, well, where the hell's Pikachu at? Because if you know, like in Pokemon Red and Blue, Pikachu's no more important than any other Pokemon. He's just another one of them, right? But if you read the manga, and you watched the cartoon, Pikachu was obviously incredibly important. So, yeah, when I play Pokemon Yellow, I only play Pokemon Yellow, it's because Pikachu's with me the whole time. And I'm good with that. Some people talked about not liking him as much. I was the opposite. So, to kind of wrap it up, I'm not going to go too much into transformative experiences. We're actually right at time. But the general idea is all of this can be discussed in terms of changing who we are. Right? So, we start the lecture with just the idea that there's more to entertainment than enjoyment. And then we can talk about enjoyment and appreciation. And some of this can be connected to the basic idea of transformation, and that interactive narratives in games and VR may have this power to help us be something different, just like any other form of narrative. I'll invite you sometime to play this game if you haven't already. It's a really great example of a transformative game where you play it like a fighting game, but you're actually fighting yourself, and it's an anxiety video game. And it's kind of a wild one if you get a chance. And I'm gonna, for time's sake, I'm gonna kind of shortcut some of the transformation conversation. I'll quickly suggest that we can talk about it in terms of enactment. We can transform ourselves, like by playing a different character. So you take on someone else's persona. Alex, I think you mentioned this game and like not liking one of the characters, and that was sort of the thing where you're forced to play a character you do not like.
I think I can throw my last question here.
Okay.
Why does kaleidoscope storytelling, the one in reading is mentioned as where you can play different sides of the story, tend to be really hit or miss? Because I've personally never heard someone say a game or other storytelling medium was just all right or okay. I've only heard like the game was absolutely fantastic, like I've heard for Fire Emblem Three Houses, or was just horrible, which I've heard for The Last of Us 2. Is it related to the difficulty of the storytelling method, or is it something else?
I don't know if there's
because people that enjoy something are going to say they really enjoyed it, and people that didn't enjoy something are going to be very adamant about their hate. It's the negativity bias, which is if something is hated, if it's widely hated, then people are going to talk about it more than if they like it. Because if I like food, I'm just going to eat it, and I'm going to be like, oh, that's pretty good. But if I hate that food, I'm going to be like, that was terrible. And I'm going to consider going on like Yelp and posting a review.
And I'm going to extend...
I don't really see anyone with a middle ground.
So I'm going to extend what Alex is talking about and go back to this. In some ways, I think it's a paradox of games. no one's going to critique the game that was kind of challenging. Like, that's what you expect. You expect to play a game, jump on things, shoot shit, and then turn it off, right? But when you get into something that's more complicated, there's a much bigger risk there. And if somebody doesn't like it, they're furious about it. Why are you making this more than it has to be? Like, I just want to play a video game. I don't want to have to do all of these crazy narrative things. Filmmakers have the same problem. Nobody hates Avengers Infinity War, right? People like it. But you try telling a complex movie, a Citizen Kane, people love it, or they think it's the trashiest movie of all time. And I suspect it has a lot to do with what happens when you move up this ladder a little bit. You start getting at things that are a little less uncomfortable, a little more new. Alex has a great point about negativity biases kick in. It's a bit unexpected. Not to mention that with video games, you're paying a lot of money for something you don't like. Like, it's one thing to go to a movie and not like it very much. It's kind of another thing to drop $60 on something, right? And then hate it. And you're like, they're just goofing around. I just want them to focus. So my guess is that it's a mix of this above the next stuff being a bit new. And because it's a bit new, we're still learning its nuance, right? And not every player wants it. Like, not every player wants to play the Shakespearean video game. Lots of players didn't like this. Like, I didn't buy Spec Ops: The Line to get a lesson on war. I bought Spec Ops: The Line to play a shooting game. So I don't need a moral lesson from the developers. That's my suspicion. And think about this. The appreciation is more of an internal reaction. It's about meaning making. So the folks who made meaning in positive ways are going to love that, and they're going to talk about it, right? And Alex is suggesting, the folks who did not like the meaning making are going to be like, that was trash. That was a waste of my time. Does that kind of make sense? I suspect there's some polarity that goes into in our Fallout 76 data. We saw the same thing. Fallout 76 is a game that was pretty universally panned. But the people who loved it in our study loved it. And their reasons for loving it is because it was personal. They were like, I got to go back to West Virginia. I got to explore my hometown. I made these friendships in the game, and I'll never stop playing this game. So I think that part of this appreciation is that it's a little more intrapersonal, whereas part of the enjoyment bits, they're a little more ludic focused. So we talk about ludic, which is gaming, and narrative, which is the story bits. And I suspect the story bits are much more interpretive, which would explain some of these extreme patterns. That's a speculation. I don't think I have an answer for you. That's also probably an empirical question. That would be a good study to do, to find out, like, maybe you see these huge breaks in their appreciation scores and the things they reflect on. It's kind of like you go to class, and if you're going to have a funny professor, they better be funny. Because nothing is worse than somebody who is trying to be funny and is not. Right? Or you all have that friend who tells stories, and they're terrible stories. And you're like, dude, I just wish you'd be quiet. Like, I have my other friend, Joe, and Joe is quiet. I like Joe. But then, you know, Susan won't stop telling crappy stories. And I wish she'd be more like Joe. So my guess is there's a bit of a gambit that happens there as well. So I think all those things coalesce, and then you get these strange experiences. It's a great question, though. I'll tell you, the industry would like to know. But as many of you have seen online, there's a reason why AAA games dominate. We could talk all day about how great indie games are. But people also love and hate them, right? They have this polar rating. We don't see a lot of folks tearing into Spider-Man 2. You know, because it's a different type of mindset, I think. It's an interesting question. It's also, Jared, going to be one of those questions that hinders development. Because people don't want to take the risk. Or the reason the indie studios can take the risk is that that's kind of what their shtick is, right? I'll take the risk because if it's successful, the payoffs are huge. And if it's not successful, I'm no worse off than I am right now, right? Variety is another one. And this one probably gets even a little more at the kaleidoscope idea, where you're just jumping into different people all the time, right? And then personal transformation. Sometimes there's watching a character go through an entirely different metamorphosis. Okay. This is probably not the... I use Inhuman, but I don't think it's the best example. But there are games where you grow right? Okay. And then the last bit I'll mention here, as we're kind of at the very end, is the notion of the disorienting dilemma. So a big thing in transformative learning is disruption, is giving people things that throw them off their game, giving them an experience. What do we call it in the Pixar thing? The assault, right? Where I hit you with something that is totally unexpected, and I want to see how you're going to respond to that thing. And I want to see how you learn to grow with that thing. Ambushed, yeah. And there are those games that ambush you. I think Spec Ops: The Line was a good example of getting ambushed with a moral question. And the idea from a transformation process is that that's when you learn who you are, because you play through it, right? Seeking new perspectives and things of that nature. So, thank you for the day. This was awesome. This was really involved. I appreciate everybody's dialogue today. Digital games go deeper than arousal, and they look more deeply into the depths, lots of deep there, of the human experience. And sometimes these disruptions can help us better understand ourselves and understand each other. And I think that big question is going to be thinking about those technological evolutions, especially in VR, that are going to be the new extension, that are going to help us tell the stories better. Okay? That's all I have today. I appreciate everybody being on the call, and I will see you in a couple weeks. Remember, this week there is a dialogue on Moodle, and next week's is going to be voluntary. Thanks a lot, folks. I appreciate it.